Recording. All right, so I guess some people are probably gonna still come in. I did mention the email. Um, if you have any comments or anything like that, just put them in the chat. I do have it up. I am looking at it. So people know it is being recorded, but my video is pinned, and so like if your camera's on or anything like that, it just means that I can see faces instead of just blank screens for some people. But it shouldn't be in the recording. So if that's a concern, that's that. If you want to leave it off, totally fine with you. Just saying that, just putting that out there. So this is the Ecology of Colonialism course, online class, whatever you want to call it. I'm excited about this one, which is a ridiculous thing to say about something that is filled with things that are horrifically depressing. So, but it's kind of, this is stuff I've really been wanting to get more and more into, instead of messing around as much with just like continually doing some of the more introductory broad things, to focus on something a little more specifically. That said, this could be, I was looking at things last night. It's like, I want to make sure I don't talk for 10 hours. I do have a proclivity for talking a lot. In fact, in a 2-hour history of green anarchy class I taught last week, it was an hour and 45 minutes before I even got to the Green Scare. So that ended up going for like 3 hours. If you have to leave at any point, anybody who's got this link should have, or the video link, anybody who's got the email effectively will get the video. So if you miss anything, it'll all be there. I do encourage people to ask questions or anything like that if they need to clarify. Just put it in the chat, or also let me know if you want to be unmuted, and I can do that, or you can do that. I don't know. Actually, I don't know much about Zoom, so doing my best. Go ahead and drink some water. But yeah, so first off, I want to acknowledge that this is occupied Lenape Susquehannock land. That will come into a bit more of the discussion later on, but it's impossible at this point in time, at this moment in time, and I mean, it shouldn't really ever be the case, so you can't talk about that kind of acknowledgement without also acknowledging I'm about an hour and a half away from Carlisle, which is a Carlisle Indian School or Carlisle Industrial School. From 1879 to 1918, or 10,000 indigenous children were stolen from all around the world, and like you run through this academy through the explicit purpose of civilizing. This is an explicit act of genocide. Richard Henry Pratt, who was the founder architect of Carlisle, was actually the founder and architect of much of the residential school program. In fact, he's the one who famously said, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Sorry, my dog is whining. It's a horrific part of reality. It's also something that indigenous peoples the world over have never stopped talking about. Have never said anything short of just talking about the industrial programs, the residential school programs that happened here. They're happening in Canada. They happen in Australia. Like basically anywhere that settler colonial states exist, the residential school programs are happening. Currently in India, I think there's 130,000 indigenous children in factory schools. Exact same mission, indigenous kids being pushed into the labor economy as slaves, and ostensibly being Christianized or given Western values, in the sense that instead of being called slaves, they're just basically indentured servants. So these processes and these patterns go on and on and on, and they're carried on throughout the history of civilization in differing forms, but they are all effective means of genocide. And what we're seeing right now, when we're seeing all these bodies being counted, not found, but counted at these schools, particularly in Canada, we're well over 1,000 at this point. It's not something that's news for indigenous people, but it's definitely something that's going to be a validation of the fact that these things have been going on. And even though in Canada there was a Truth and Reconciliation Committee who effectively, held this whole foray, this entire deal about the residential school program and trying to make some kind of amends for it, effectively did nothing, except acknowledged completely that these things happened, and worse, we're not going to do anything about it. And now the bodies are starting to be exhumed in some places and brought back to the societies where they're from. Carlisle has 186 child graves there. The graveyard is actually, it's like the boarding school graveyard is on Google Maps. Like it's noted. I mean, again, these things aren't even necessarily hidden. They're there. They're just, it becomes part of the scenery. It's one of the main gates at Carlisle School. Carlisle started as a fort, became the residential school 1879 to 1918, and then continued on to an active military base. It's continually right now an active military base. The graveyard marks one of the primary entranceways for the Carlisle barracks, which are effectively very much still in purpose, are still in use. I was there Thursday to put up a sign about the native children that were stolen, and their bodies lay there. And not even 2 minutes, I was detained by 3 military police. Um, Very tense. I did go out with a warning. I was not arrested, but I was detained and told that if I'm found again on the premises, that I'll be arrested. If I hold a sign without a permit within the entire city of Carlisle, I'll be arrested. So that's how far they're willing to go. I mean, but just to show where things are at, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee stuff is like early 2010s going on. The bodies are starting to be counted now. It's like almost a decade in that, but we know that these bodies were at Carlisle this whole time, and only now is anybody doing anything about it to actually start to take some of these children's remains, and get them back to the societies to which these children had come from. These would be elders are missing from, and have been missing from, and the 10 kids' bodies have gone back, but they've known about that, and we've it took all this time for anything to be done about it. The graves were marked for the most part there. Well, I should say some of them were marked. Not all of them were marked. Most of them that were marked at all would be a tribal affiliation and potentially year of death. It was hard to see. I mean, it's always been there. It's right there when you go there now. It's fenced off currently because they're working there. And there's indigenous groups that are working. Of course, the military is saying that they want it to be done in a like fashion, because there's a solemnness to military cemeteries that they want to uphold. Of course, they being the military, because they weren't fucking soldiers. They weren't part of the military. They were children, and they were stolen. So it's pretty insane. It's a horrific situation, but all this time, that's what it's taking to get any kind of action or any kind of recognition or any kind of validation off of these things that we have known, and these things that have become part of the tapestry of the institutional fabric of this empire, and do nothing about it. But you go out there with the fucking sign, you say anything about being genocide, 2 minutes. Like the amount of time it takes to be seen holding a sign and walking on those grounds, that's how quick they can act. So it's pretty disgusting. It just goes to show, though, that there's a lot more to be said. There's a lot more to be done, and especially right now, in light of these findings, a lot of indigenous people are being faced aggressively with white supremacist over trolls in response to Cancel Canada Day. If you're online or anything like that, there's a lot of people putting up hashtag settler collector. The emotional burden and of dealing with white supremacists, and also not even being able to just mourn without being taunted by white supremacists, like that burden can't be on indigenous people. If you're a settler, you just have to like own this position, and don't do this white savior shit where you're trying to speak for, be a voice for people. Just shut them down. I mean, well, I feel compelled to mention them. It's kind of like a couple of things to take care of before getting into it. But of course, this is all very much a part of this discussion. There's a new Indigenous Action podcast I listened to yesterday. I was talking about the effectively talking in ways about the white savior complex and how it relates to the anti-pipeline movements and stuff like that. And the episode they were talking on yesterday, they were checking in with the Line 3 work, and particularly some people from the GNU Collective and some other collectives up there who have been doing long time frontlines work. And then there was this thing, it's Bruce, I actually hadn't heard the term. I think I had seen it, but I hadn't really like put much to it. They held a white savior complex, the non-governmental organization, the NGO complex, hosted this thing up there. I think it was last weekend, the Treaty People gathering. And the Treaty People thing is the new liberal term for trying to say it's like, well, we're the people who upheld the treaties. We're respecting that as a way to kind of like downgrade themselves ideally from being settlers, which that's pretty fucking gross. There's a really good discussion in that podcast. It's really good to listen to. It's really important to listen to. I will say it now, I'll say it a million times. It's going to continually be a thing throughout this conversation and throughout any one of these conversations. It basically needs to be the bedrock of any conversation about colonialism, is really understanding and knowing and staying in your lane while also being very actively and proactively anti-colonial. And I mean, of course, all this is very much against civilization. And colonialism is the baseline for what this is. In fact, it goes back before capitalism even. So it's like taking off a bigger chunk, but the nature of this expansionism, and we're going to be looking at in particular as Western colonialism, is that's the face of civilization that has really taken over the world to create this globalized parasitic system that we're existing in now, where not only have the lands been burning and forests and everything been burning like forever now, you know, we went from rivers burning to now the ocean is currently on fire. It's a pretty hard time, but nothing about this was unpredictable. Nothing about this was something we couldn't have known was going to happen. We couldn't have avoided at any point in time, and that's the hard part, the undercurrent of everything about colonialism and everything we're about to discuss today. It didn't need to happen. We didn't need to get where we are. Nobody has benefited from it. There's one of the greatest wealth disparities in the history of humanity existing right now. And of course, I mean, like, that's in part a kind of thing that you could say solely because the metric for wealth or the metric for value is one and the same. It's obviously much different when you're looking at situations where somebody can be rich and somebody's a slave or somebody's enslaved. Very different dynamics, but at this point, it's all along relatively the same metric. And within that, you know, in the United States, we've had this pandemic going on for over a year now, and saw the transfer of wealth of 39 trillion that rich people made and 37 million that working class poor people lost during that time. It's very quantifiable and very, very clear. One second. No, sorry. But yeah, I mean, like, as far as this conversation goes, as far as where these things are at, something that gets mentioned at the end of that episode is something I think about a lot and talk about a lot in terms of like mental health, in terms of like understanding and relating to how we deal with trauma, how we deal with the realities of civilization, how we deal with the ways that we're impacted by domestication, domesticating structures, and the hierarchies and the various tiers of oppression that are faced and created because of civilization, and the way that you're able to see things or not see things. The important thing in any of these discussions is to really like understand that the individualized sense, the way the kind of trauma response that domestication instills within all of us is leaning towards individualization. It makes it so that everything that we do, everything that we see is meant to be taken as like an insult or attack against us individually. But you can't take this shit, like, you have to understand your personal involvement with it, but you can't also take it personally. What ends up happening is that the number one thing that people are going to do in these situations is be defensive. If you're being defensive, you're not going to hear what the other person's saying. And if you look at the way that a lot of these discussions go, when people were talking last year, when Black Lives Matter insurrections were just decimating so much of this. It should have been decimating this mythos, and people were theoretically talking about white privilege, talking about systemic oppression. Like there was a lot of performative aspects. A lot of performative aspects that were happening within all those uprisings, within all that resistance, where people were paying lip service to the ideas of undermining whiteness or identifying white supremacy, most of the time seeing that as something external. Like we're talking about whiteness, we're talking about a way of perceiving the world. This is the impact or the goal of these tiered kind of hierarchies. This is why you don't see things. This is why you can have a marked children's graveyard at a military base for indigenous children on Google Maps, and other people can also be like, well, it didn't happen or wasn't so bad. The sign across the street, State Historical Marker, talks about the good intentions not only of Pratt, fucking scumbag, but of the industrial school system, the residential school system. The road that I had to be followed out by MPs on was Jim Thorpe Road, or Jim Thorpe Drive. Jim Thorpe was a very famous Olympian who went through Carlisle. Like all these different ways, it's like this stuff really isn't hidden, but it's deliberately put in a way so that your way of being domesticated, your way of being skewed into the world, these filters such as whiteness or whatever, like all the different kind of things, the class, race, whatever they're going to put in there, is going to make it so that you're incapable of seeing or understanding or empathizing with other positions or other views of the system. And that's why you get all these different reactions of people being like, well, I didn't see this thing, or I didn't see that thing. And there's this tendency, we saw it a lot this year with people talking about, Juneteenth becoming a holiday, and people talking more about the Tulsa race riots. There was a lot more white people saying things like, I didn't know this. I didn't know about this situation. It's like, okay, you should know about this, yes. But the way that things are perceived, the way that reality has been handed to us, the way that this system works is through a process of historicization. It's the process of taking all these different things that happen and turning them to events, to make them feel like there's something historic, something removed, and something isolated to a particular time, a particular scene, a particular number of things that happen. Like undermining this historicization process is an important part of anti-colonial work. Like another way of seeing narratives, another way of relating to the world, another way of understanding that we are storytellers. And while the concrete realities of civilization, of colonialism, are based on very material things, very extractivist, resource-oriented movements and changes and wars, everything like that, the narratives they tell us are going to change the way that we view these things. And they're going to isolate them. It's going to make it so that if this fire goes out, they're going to talk about like, oh, this was the one disaster that happened here. Completely disregarded from the Deepwater Horizon. That was same Gulf of Mexico. No idea if they actually ever completely dealt with that situation. These things all kind of compound, but by isolating them into events and highlighting specific things, it makes it possible so that you don't understand the system and you just see these reactions where people are talking about the Tulsa race riots. They're saying like, I didn't know about this. And so what they're doing is like, I should be taught about this, and putting all their energy into saying like, well, we need to educate people about what happened in Tulsa. It's like, yes, but the problem isn't that you shouldn't just learn about it in this instance. You shouldn't just learn about Carlisle. You shouldn't learn about Kamloops and this and that. Like there's different places, these different things that happen. You have to understand the systems. And that's why this is called the ecology of colonialism. What we're talking about civilization. I mean, this is the explicit goal of all colonizers, particularly Western, the colonial Christian narrative of we need to use this tool of God, this thing. We have this one worldview that's been cast into stone and reprinted a million times. It's devoid of place, it's devoid of time, but it's one book, it's absolute, it's one God. All these things are laid out. And conversion is an important part of flattening the world in such a way that these narratives can place themselves within them. And so it's anti-ecological in every sense of the word. And by civilization, I mean the culture of cities. In this case, there's a lot of things that I talk about in other places about how that that pattern kind of evolves and moves. Right now, we're focused on Western civilization. We're talking about Western colonialism, particularly uh, Western colonialism after the 15th century. But these things all build. They don't. Nothing comes out of nowhere. They all build upon each other. And so, what I want to be able to do, what my goal here is, and it's really the goal of all my work, is to say civilization is not a biological organism. If it was a biological organism, it'd be a horrible one. But what it is it's parasitic upon ecological situations. It exists in an ecological sense because it is predatory. It just bleeds. It is innately extractivist. And so the mythos that it has to create is going to try and make it seem something greater, and I mean heavenly ordained, of course, something ever present, something ever powerful, something omniscient. Uh, but the reality of civilization is naturally is that it is just a parasite upon ecological situations. It's constantly having to undermine the realities that you can see if you start to look at things from an ecological perspective. And from an ecological perspective, I don't mean like environmentalism. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about the strict sense of ecology, as in like the sphere of biological organisms, the communications, the relationships between biological organisms. And how that plays out, of course, strongly impacts everything about us because, of course, we are biological organisms. We're all animals. We're social animals. And there's a lot to be said about the way that the relationships of indigenous peoples to the lands, the relationship that is there as being very much part of this, like this entire ecology. And if you've got involved in rewilding, you've fallen in love with land on that is stolen or colonized land. Um, that absence, that loss, is absolutely felt. You cannot have a relationship with the land. It's like okay, I'm gonna fall in love with this person who just had the person, the love of their life, murdered. I'm not never gonna acknowledge that. Or enslaved, imprisoned, and chained, removed from the equation in any way, or even just in word alone. I mean, because not all indigenous people are gone, but they're still very much here. But that absence or that removal, that intentionality is absolutely crucial. And I also just want to say, I'm going to be saying this a number of times. I'm talking about this as genocide. This absolutely is genocide, ecocide, genocide, all of these things. The arguments that are coming up again surrounding all this are trying to say this or that is technically not genocide. They're bullshit. I mean, the linchpin for that whole argument that academics are going to hinge on and then um, monsters are going to grab onto is it's not genocide because the intentionality wasn't to kill everybody or remove everybody. That's we have ample evidence in every sense of the word about how intentional all these acts of genocide and colonialism have been and how explicit they've been in the goal of extermination. The idea that you gauge genocide by the effectiveness of the intention or the effectiveness of the cleansing, I mean, it's disgusting. Nobody does that. Like, I'm saying this as a Jew, as somebody who's the genocide in my sphere, my culture, or whatever, that has been usurped into whiteness and then re-abused by Zionists, is a validated genocide. But of course, I'm here. So you don't call genocides. It's like this proof that you don't call genocide by the effectiveness of the killing, despite the fact that we know without question that every living group that European colonizers have faced or have come into contact with has seen, on average, 50 to 100% die off. The average being about 90% in virtually all these cases. And I think that's important to say, and it's something worth saying as well. When we look at stuff like population, a lot of these numbers are really skewed because of kind of piggybacking theories. The numbers are going to continually get higher for the number of peoples that were indigenous to and living in the Americas, or living in basically the entire southern hemisphere as well, prior to European contact. Dr. Paul Steve just put out a book on the an indigenous perspective on the Paleolithic in the Americas. A lot of the ideas about the number of people that could be here were predicated on the ridiculous idea that everybody came over in the Bering Strait, which Vine Deloria Jr. had been saying decades ago, reiterating, recapitulating different indigenous memories, indigenous stories that involve knowing about the ice ages in the Americas, about knowing other forms of or other stories about coming to the Americas and being here for longer times, and describing mass ecological events that happened that would have all been prior to when the Bering Strait was possible for crossing. Of course, some people did cross using the Bering Strait, but it doesn't mean that the entire population or entire populating of these continents came from that means. But what it means is that if the working principle, and you can see this all the time in history and in anthropology and archaeology. In fact, I was talking to one of the big hunter-gatherer anthropologists, one of the people who have been involved in the hunter studies, our conference, and all these things. When I was talking to him years ago now, but there was carbon dates showing 130,000 years ago for occupations or for carbon dating on items in the what is now the United States. His simple reaction was impossible. It's like, it's not really impossible. It's impossible according to these theories. So Vine Deloria Jr., Red Earth White Lies, had gone through and shown like there's bias confirmation that has to go into the understanding of when you would get a carbon dated item that predates theoretical understandings of occupation. And I mean, even something like when you go to Meadowcroft, which is not very far from here, pushing back occupation from about 12,000 to about 17,000 years ago, was a monumental thing within the archaeological scene. So when you're talking about saying 100,000 years back, that's a much different thing. But if your theory is going to solely be based on everything has to match the timeline for the Bering Strait, then the extrapolations that you're going to have as far as what the populations look like prior to contact with colonizers, with conquerors, is going to be very different. But also you're going to have to understand that the numbers that were assumed for a lot of indigenous societies were based primarily off of initial contact with colonizers and conquerors and missionaries. And the problem with that is that colonialism sets off a wave. Contact sets off a wave, and things move ahead in front of it. And this is another aspect of this ecology of colonialism. Like, you have to understand that the shock waves of contact with Westerners, of the Western diseases, with the outright just insatiable, murderous, wanton violence of colonialism, then you're going to see that the existence of steel tools, particularly the use of guns and things like that, and machetes, it moves out, and when it invades existing cosmologies, it really creates a ripple effect that's going to cause warfare and spread and violence and disease and death and contagions to spread out vastly far ahead of when white people are going to follow up. And so what was being seen was, by the time white people effectively got to a lot of the places in the Americas and the Southern Hemisphere, the contagion had already hit. So the numbers that had been seen at that time were being estimated to be a part of the pre-contact standard, when in fact no such thing really existed. The wake had already hit. So we're extrapolating the numbers that were already showing our impact before the impact was considered to even be possible. In ecological terms, absolutely makes sense. It's just like chain reactions happen. But in a colonial sense, in this historical narrative where it's just like this point, this event, this contact, this couldn't have possibly had any impact on that because this person hadn't been there yet. It's like, okay, but they were here and they talked to this person, they travel down. I mean, again, these are all different kinds of things. When you flip the script of civilization, when you stop listening to the narratives as far as being ultra simplistic to the point of being outright racist in almost every regard, but also explicitly involving indigenous or non-white erasure, then every other story, every other narrative is going to be completely superseded by that reality. And that's what we're seeing. And that's the kind of thing that we're having to actively work against and having to undermine by trying to have these kinds of conversations. You have to learn to see these things as they are. You have to understand your relationship to these different aspects. And it doesn't do any good to get stuck in this whole thing of being like, well, how am I going to atone for this specific thing or that specific thing? It's like, okay, we could be anti-colonial. Like, decolonial is a thing that indigenous people can do. That's not our lane if you're a settler. Uh, but you can certainly be against all this shit, and you can also take the place, that position, and try to expand out and try and undermine all these different methods of historicization and separation, removal, and erasure, and start to listen, and then learn to attack, learn to like amplify voices without trying to own or possess or center whiteness, center settler sentiments, settler issues within those conversations. So that's like really kind of a baseline thing that has to happen for this kind of a conversation for it to move forward. So there's a lot of different places to get really involved in this conversation. And one thing I always say, sorry, you also have to excuse me being a little extra fidgety and things like that. My back is out. I'm in a lot of pain, and also it's low barometric pressure is a death blow. So if I'm a little skittish, that's why. But there's kind of like things that come out. Like there's a lot of books that come out that tend to focus on a history of one thing or a history of one place. As much as I say historicization is an issue, I do typically find that these kinds of things, these kind of approaches, these books, and that kind of work is really good, really relevant. I mean, there's a lot of things where you'll see a Barnes and Noble kind of big hit, top seller book where people will try to make the case, like Mark Kurlansky is a guy who does this all the time. Like this one thing is a thing that completely changed the world, and there's aspects of it where there's some truth to that. If you look at Cod or Salt, as he did, um, yeah, I mean the trade and all these things is huge, but it can give the chance to really take a look at one item and show how this ecological perspective, to see these shock waves and to see how these things fit into this globalized economy and how those shock waves work and how, like, from this perspective that we're in, where we're everybody who's here, I'm assuming, is probably in some degree of like first world consumer roles, how easily accessible so many of these items are. It makes it really easy to take for granted that each one of these things has its own history and that history is interwoven within everything else. If you pull on any one of these strings, if you take any item that was mass produced, you could very easily unravel the entirety of civilization within that item. And if you use that platform as a way to try and expose the greater system, that's great. That's really good. I mean, like, so one of my last book I wrote, Cold Personality, is talking about ayahuasca, but it's one of these things. Um, again, there was a lot of questions for me when I was writing about that intentionality and perspective in terms of writing it, but looking at ayahuasca and centering on the killing of a Shipibo Konobo plant healer, Olivia Arvalo, and placing that within the history of context in the place and trying to unravel these things, come to understand that this person that was relatively similar to me in ways, this Woodruff, his Canadian guy, he's into mushrooms, like hunting mushrooms, and into a lot of similar things. But really, it was like got into this whole path, and I'm sure all of us are familiar with people talking about ayahuasca and using it to treat PTSD, using it to treat mental illness, and using it to treat addiction. Really went down the rabbit hole of, okay, this is an extractivist relationship, but I can take this thing, I can take these prayers, I can take these songs, and I can take this like idealized version of these rituals surrounding this, and I can take those and place them in Western societies, Western contexts, and it's a powerful thing that's going to be available to help the people around me. Like, the whole thing, the entirety of civilization, and the entirety of the whiteness and its perspective relationship to the world is based off good intentions, which is an extremely problematic thing, but also outright fascistic. So it becomes impossible to tell that story without also talking about rubber. Getting a lot into the history of the rubber boom, this relatively short-lived thing, but it is an embodiment of all these different aspects of colonialism, all the different ways in which industrialism and the Industrial Revolution both made possible and made necessary the kind of consumption and expansionism implicit in all these different things. Before I get distracted, I'll be right back. 1 second. I apologize about that, and I hope not everybody else is being distracted by a high-pitched whining sound. But hopefully that will take care of that for a little bit. All right, so rubber and ayahuasca, one big example here. So the Shipibo Konobo indigenous societies, it's actually two that have combined over time for a number of different things I really get into in the book, but it's just like this extrapolation of this one element of the story about extractivist empires. So what I want to be able to do, what I hope to be able to instill, is this ability to take, or this wherewithal to take a look at different items, different products, and different aspects of civilization, different places at different times, and to start to pull these threads and start to see how this parasitic thing, this civilization that requires in unbelievable inputs, how it spreads and how it's kind of like moving back and forth. And with rubber, for example, you get like, I'm going to go into great detail. I go in the book. I do recommend reading the book. The rubber trade was one of the most horrific moments in the history of civilization. It happened between 1880 to 1920. The phrase "crimes against humanity" is because of the rubber trade, because of the rubber boom, the rubber bubble, and the Congo and the Amazon were the places where this was happening, and it created these slave systems that were being used to horrifically and extremely violently force indigenous peoples and bring in African peoples from into the Amazon in some places, but mostly this is done by indigenous people, indigenous enslaved people, and run by missionaries, was to just get as much rubber as you possibly can, just completely. In most cases, there's this gouger rubber, it's a weaker rubber. You take the whole tree. So I mean, just denuding forests, but also these practices of bleeding rubber trees that were endemic to entire regions, just because it would found that rubber actually had a use that could be used in terms of industrialization. Like we wouldn't have internal combustion engines if we didn't have rubber. You wouldn't have electricity without rubber. All these things, conduits, insulation. The places that you don't see it are the places where it matters the most, in ways that it matters most in the world. But you know, the ebb and flow of all these different items begins to really go into this massive global scale. And so you can follow one thing and you can really trace it through all these different steps. So we have the rubber trade, Amazon, Congo. There was a similar pattern that had happened in terms of quinine, which was and remains the primary way of dealing with malaria, which was one thing that kept colonizers out of a lot of regions for a long time. Of course, they modified by acting in other horrifically cruel ways, and it's one of the most depressing facts I gotten yesterday and going through some of the stuff was that the lifespan of Europeans in sub-Saharan Africa prior to quinine being understood as a treatment for malaria was 1 year. So like malaria was doing a really good job of keeping colonizers out, removing the potential for settler colonialism. Unfortunately, this another rare forest element made it possible to treat people and then create more settler colonies. Although they had already established a system where instead of European colonizers being the front people, they just created and monetized or created and capitalized on hierarchies they could within African kingdoms at the time for going on slave raids to bring slaves or bring enslaved people to the ports. There's also been a lot written about the ports, a lot written about the slave ships, and the catastrophic side of looking through this history and understanding this history is like it is so mathematically impossible, short the sheer quantity of people coming out of Europe, that any of this stuff ever lasted. Like the average lifespan of a settler in like Jamestown or a place like that, an initial settler was 25 years. The life for Europeans working on slave ships was rarely much better than people who were enslaved themselves. They could just keep throwing people at this, and most of these explorers we know that have reset the globe and reset the map for European expansion, they typically probably only went out about 3 times before they were killed, and most of them were killed. Cook, his statue got torn down. I think it was yesterday, and thrown into the water. It's great to see all these statues being torn down. It's wonderful, but Cook was killed by indigenous people, and yeah, on the shore. So that's pretty common. And then there's other people like Henry Hudson. His own crew mutinied on the third trip and sent him and everybody else that was heading the expeditions out to die in Hudson Bay. Like that's the hard part about all this thing is like they barely made it. They barely made it. They just kept throwing more and more people at it, and it's discouraging in many ways just because like why the fuck did it happen? Like when you look at there's a book I really love. Eric Wolf is an anthropologist, wrote Europe and the People Without History, and he talks about Europe at 1400, and there was nothing about Europe at 1400 that would have given any indication that it was at all possible for that region, that part of the world, to be able to become such a superpower that could be the primary colonizer for virtually everywhere else in the world. It wasn't, you could say in some degrees, and colonizers would say it was luck or ability, but like it was just the sheer willingness and utter brutality that had come out of Europe at that time. This completely like soulless existence that had predicated and really built itself in Europe in such a way that it was able to overflow into the rest of the world. And this sheer brutality is what made it possible. I mean, like, that's a really depressing point that I want to get across often. Like people, especially now, I mean, I think it's always going to be impossible to defend civilization as a whole. I mean, this is a horrific thing that's been imposed upon the world. And I do want to reiterate, I don't know what degree people who are here or people who will be listening to this have of interaction with anti-civ critiques or anti-civ anything necessarily is. The tendency when people are reacting to it tend to react to this idea of thinking that anti-civ is basically just this edgy kind of thing. What we're talking about is completely impractical, and immediately going to this thing of like defensiveness that or defensiveness I was talking about in the first place. It's like, okay, well, if you're against civilization, what are you going to do about this? How are you going to handle this? It's like, well, one, we're not talking about taking power, so like this is a different kind of thing. The way you're approaching this is political, and the way we're approaching it is anti-political. That's a big like misfire. That's like we're not talking the same way. We're not answering the same questions or speaking the same language, really. But the problem with it is that if you start at the wrong place, if you take into consideration all these different aspects of how these stories are told, how things move, how the situations arise and expand and everything like that, you're getting set into a different way of viewing the world than the way that we've been told through civilization that we're supposed to. So the natural inclination, because we're meant to identify, because we as settlers have no culture effectively. We are like, whiteness is the vacuum between all the cultures killed and absorbed in pieces by colonizers. It's not a culture, it's not a basis. Like, because we are that vacuum, we are clinging to it for life because it's the way we perceive the world and it's the way we perceive value is through conquered, pillaged, and plundered goods, or pieces of cultures pillaged and plundered along the way. So what ends up happening is that you respond defensively, or people respond defensively to the idea that civilization itself is problematic. This is definitely a RV in the cul-de-sac situation. Like, people tend to think it's like, okay, well, we're just identifying this as a problem as this or that, and that it's totally impractical. It's like, you got to get past the denial of it. Like, first things first, where we're at when we're talking about this critique is we have arrived at a completely unsustainable, untenable situation. This is how, and these are the consequences of it. Like, the first step through all this is to disrupt and end the denial. To say, like, these are the consequences of it. And, like, hold off for a second on trying to say, well, what are we going to do about it? The first thing we have to do is identify that there's a problem. Like, the denial, the reactions we get are always just like, well, what are you going to do? It's like, okay, so, like, the left really has had a lot of problems with anticiv for a number of reasons. The left there's a lot of people on the left who were attacking green anarchists, were attacking anti-civilization anarchists, and effectively really just completely dismissing indigenous resistance and indigenous existence in uncountable and unimaginable ways that were outright racist and dismissive in every regard. And then there's been this about face where a lot of indigenous resistance and indigenous movements have in recent years been more and more co-opted or attempted to be co-opted by the left in ways that are horrifically inconsistent with the general idea that the left as a whole does not oppose industrialization. The left as a whole can try and say that they want to be involved more with trying to make ecologically sustainable civilization, whatever the fuck that might be. All the people that I was arguing with that were other anarchists on the left for years were rooting for Musk. They're rooting for the kind of things that he was saying. When Musk started talking shit about how he's going to have $1,000 solar unit that he's going to make possible for everybody to have on their home, and it was going to get like 5 gigawatts or whatever. Sorry, I was just reading a comment. Like, it was just based off throwing things out there and saying all these things are going to happen. It covered up for the fact that, like, people wanted to believe that there's going to be some way of sustaining this way of living that was going to be possible or palatable. And literally what was being said was by leftists was any talk about living outside of civilization, or any talk about sustaining the ability to live outside of civilization, or talking about the faults of civilization itself were inherently genocidal, because then what we're going to have happen, all these people are going to die, because how could anybody be supported that way? And again, there's a lot more questions to throw about that, about population numbers in general. As I was saying earlier, like, we don't actually know. Those numbers are going to increasingly go up. But if you look at the United States right now, 1.3% of the US economy is based on agriculture. 10% of it is the fucking military. Like, you want to talk about what civilization is? Civilization is just hoarding and protecting power. And it's like, anybody who's going to say, well, we're going to be able to do something different with it, it's like, one, are you? It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. We've tried everything, and it always ends up this way. If you create situations where power is possible, where hoarding wealth is possible. And we need to undermine that and undercut that entire thing, but also just to point out, as we have and as we continue to do, you can't have civilization, you can't have production, you can't have industrialism without these consequences. We can show that. we can know that. If you're just being in denial about the consequences of it, and worse, like right now we're seeing a revival of socialists and tankies and stuff like that, where they're outright dismissing that socialist nations, one, exist, and two, are creating situations of genocide, ethnocide, ethnic cleansing. Just fill the revolutions are followed by gallows. Um, you can't just deny this shit. We need to at least start talking about it. We need to identify this as a problem. We can't just be like, there's a fiery pit in the middle of the ocean that's solely because of capitalism and socialism would save us. It's like the socialist revolutions that took place in China and Russia and all these different places. The first thing they did was massively have to upend the industrialization processes. That's the basis of the Russian revolutions, updating the Tsarist regimes and their their forms of agriculture to industrial forms. Um, all the revolutionaries are pretty clear about this stuff. They talk about it. They uphold the idea of progress. They uphold the idea of evolving the systems and in many ways keeping the capitalists on. And even Marx himself was talking about the necessity of capitalist production to create the necessary evils to get them out of the way so that the fruits of that labor could be taken over and then redistributed. Never once does it happen. It's not going to happen. It's a pipe dream. It's a cargo cult of industrialism. The reality of civilization is, the reality of industrialism is, sooner or later you're going to end up with a fire in the middle of the ocean because you're trying to sustain something that cannot be sustained. And at this point, we're facing the end of the Holocene, in which case agriculture as a whole potentially is going to become increasingly less viable. And primary cash crops are becoming increasingly more toxic, becoming increasingly harder to grow. The vast changes in weather patterns and climate conditions on this trajectory, and with all life that we know, for the most part, being completely eradicated. Certainly the conditions that make it possible for humans to exist are slowly being destroyed by this entire process. So like, we have to be honest about these things, right? It doesn't seem like that big of an ask, but that's really where we're having to start with all of this. And again, that's the point of the critique. Is like, okay, well, the first thing we have to do, don't immediately jump to like, what are we going to do about it? Because the answer to the same question, what is civilization going to do about it? It doesn't have any answers. Like, nothing that's been proposed, nothing that was even like moderately suggested about how to potentially deal with ongoing climate change, which is not, we're way past the point of being able to say by 2030 these things have to happen to change this. Like, we look at the uprisings that have been happening in the Arab Spring, the Middle East, all these different situations where mass trajectories of diaspora are all a direct relation to climate change. Endemic climate change is having climate instability. That's been going on for a long time. And if you look at the hellscape that is much of Syria and all these different situations, and just the global refugee crisis that we're having in all these different places, like, as humans, as a species, nomadism has been a core part of who we are. It's helped us move around. It's helped us. Mobility is how we deal with conflict resolution. It's how we deal with all these different things. Borders are as antithetical to all that as it could possibly get. And the increasingly militarization of borders and the increasing rise of nationalistic, fascistic fervor is a direct response to the realities that climate change and climate instability are making it so that the question that we're having to answer as anti-civ people, what are you going to do with all these people, are being completely and utterly ignored by just doubling down on the gusto of industrialization and colonization, which is civilization. Just doubling down on, like, we're going to have more control. Like, on the one side, we're going to have more control. On the other side, we're going to be able, like, we're going to create this world where we're going to all exist within this bevy. And the reality of it is that, we are seeing areas where, like, that access to some kind of controlled environment or something like that is a difference of life and death. I mean, we're exacerbating the problem at every level. We're making water undrinkable. We have been doing this for some time. The first climate change events coincided with, one, the origin of rice paddy agriculture, and then also, like, the killing off of the initial wave of death in the Americas by colonizers so impacted the entirety of the ecosystems here that the little ice age was the result of it. Like there was a shift in climate change and in climate stability solely because of the offset of so much death and destruction. It's like you want to talk about the relationship land is between peoples and place. Like the climate actually shift. You can see in the climate record. This is where tens, if not hundreds of millions of people were murdered to sustain this fucking nightmare. So yeah, I don't really want to deal with people's defensiveness about what we're going to do next. It's like, all right, let's pull back here. Let's start with understanding and addressing that this is a problem. This is innately unsustainable, and see how this whole thing works and understand how this whole thing works, because it's really hard to sit here and just throw darts. Like I always tell people, like, you know, one thing about doing these kind of arguments or getting these kind of discussions, never answer a question you're not comfortable with. You're dealing with other people's frameworks. You're dealing with things that they're coming at it and they're loaded. That's a loaded question. What are you going to do with this population? You can turn around and you can say, well, what are you going to do with this population? There's no answer. But it's better to say, well, let's talk about this situation. Let's talk about how we got here. Let's talk about it honestly. There's actually a really good documentary series that came out on HBO recently called Exterminate All the Brutes. It's based on a book by Sven Lindquist called Exterminate the Brutes. Another book that is really amazing, I strongly recommend, Michel Rolfe-Trujillo, Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, as far as talking about the whole process of historicization. This book is probably the best. And it deals with the Haitian Revolution and why anti-colonial revolution couldn't be seen at the time or understood. Also in terms of like Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History, Michel Rolfe-Trujillo. And then the other one was Exterminate All the Brutes, Sven Lindquist, who also wrote Terra Nullius, which is a fantastic book. Silencing the Past and this book were part of our book club for Black and Green, actually. Exterminate All the Brutes and Terra Nullius are also available in one book called The Dead Do Not Die. Sven is a very good reader. And writer, sorry. And Roseanne Dunbar Ortiz, Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. That's kind of the premise for this documentary series that Exterminate All the Brutes. That was really good. But effectively carried out the same kind of thing. Like, we need to start at the point of understanding what it takes to get here and what it takes to sustain civilization and colonialism on this level. What does it look like? And where does it exist? Because I mean, the big thing is that, and you'll see this a lot. I'm sure everybody's familiar with it. If you're new to like arguing with people about colonialism or civilization, you know, if you haven't seen it, you're going to see it. The number one thing that settlers are going to say is, well, it's done and over with, so just like get over it. It's like, okay, well, that's bullshit. Like, colonialism is an ongoing process. Civilization, domestication, all these things are ongoing processes. Like, there's never been an event. There's an idea within the narrative of progress, the narrative of civilization. 10,000 years ago, we switched from being hunter-gatherers to farmers. Boom, that's it. We move on. Society evolves in this way. And the continued existence of nomadic hunter-gatherers to this day, the continued struggles of hunter-gatherers, horticulturalists, subsistence societies, indigenous societies to continue to exist completely undermines this entire monolithic narrative that there was some change and then the genetic nature of human beings changed or whatever across the board. Like, indigenous people disprove this every second of every day. But we're trained to see colonialism as a point in the past, as a moment, as an event that happened, because it is a blinder. It's a way of changing the way that you see things and changing the relationship so that, you know, they could say, and people in power can say, well, it wasn't us, it was them, and it's done and over with anyways. I mean, this whole kind of thing about the way that people have responded to statues being removed, which is fucking great. Well, the statues are removed, not the responses. The way that people respond to those situations is always like, well, this is history. This is our history. This is who we are. And, you know, kind of put this like talking out of the side of their mouth bullshit where they could say, you know, statues are important because it tells us about all these things that it contains. the entire history of this place and how we got to be here. And, it's basically the same thing as saying that some racist mascot or name for a sports team is upholding indigenous traditions. It's like, no, it's a racist characterization. And also the same people were saying, oh, well, having a statue of a slave owner just tells us about history and all of its complexity and how complex great people are. But at the same time, they'll also be like, well, wasn't that bad. It was good. So right there, the whole thing kind of sinks itself pretty quickly. But the point of that is not necessarily to do this kind of thing of saying like this is good or bad, or avoiding sidestepping the conversation of is this good or bad, but saying, well, it is here and it is present. That's why statues we consider them infrastructure, because they are about cementing this narrative into a concrete form that is domineering and effectively, if you're in a city or in a place where these things happen or exist, it's literally standing over you. That's a form of power. That's a relationship of power. That's a reiteration of power. So we have that whole conversation happening or not happening effectively, just so there can be that cognitive dissonance between our actions in our lives and the relationships of everything around us in the world. So the goal here is to say, it's like, obviously colonialism still exists. There's all these different forms of it. You can say people like to talk about neo-colonialism, imperialism. There are differences. There are definite differences between imperialism and colonialism. There's differences between settler colonialism and extractivist colonialism. And the degree to which those differences exist, it has to do with the relationship of how colonizers and imperialists have dealt with different places. But the overriding drive for all these things is undeniably colonialism. Settler colonialism, we're going to displace these peoples and take this land. Imperialism or extractivist colonialism, imperialism is like, we're going to use the military to do this job and we're going to just take it by force. Extractivist colonialism is we're going to set up a system where we're going to extract and remove the resources from this area. Our intention is to be able to keep it as available to us forever, but the goal is not, like, the goal rarely has been in the Amazon, for example, or the Congo, for example, to try and build permanent long-term cities aside from tourist locations or hubs for extraction and distribution of the things that are being taken from those areas. And these things kind of go back and forth all over around the world. And that's where you can kind of see this flow. I started to say earlier about the rubber trade. When I got into the Kenine thing, I got a little distracted, sorry. What ended up happening is that the Kenine thing made expansion possible because it found a way to combat malaria. So the Kenine trees became a resource that were just ripped into. It's the same bubble that you see with rubber. And in fact, area was completely destroyed. And the reason that there was a bubble created around it and a horrific violence surrounding the extraction of that, what ends up happening is that some entrepreneur somewhere is going to take that seed. I'm actually forgetting his exact name. There's a guy, I think one says Hockham. I'm forgetting. Takes the tree, grabs it, hides it, carries it over, goes to the South Pacific, finds an environment that could potentially grow the same trees and replicate the seeds, create plantations. So you're transporting from one to another, and you're changing from an extractivist economy to like more of a articulated agriculture agroeconomy. Again, there's fine details about all this stuff, and it does matter, but the colonialism is the same drive. The difference is going to be is that you're going to see things like more like conquest, like that initial phase of contact that happened throughout all the Southern Hemisphere and the Americas, where people were just horrific violence blowing through, taking slaves, killing a ton of people. But then it's just kind of like there's a wake after that. Settler colonialism is we're just going to keep that up and set up a place here and then move you further on. You get articulations of the same thing, but again, there's fine points and there's differences, but that's really kind of where we are right here. So with rubber, you get the same thing. Somebody says, well, somebody took the seed in the tree and they moved it over here. with rubber, what happened at the about 1914, 1915, this guy Stedham, who learned from this other guy, takes seeds and he goes all around different places. He goes to India, he goes to South Pacific, goes to Malaysia. Eventually in Malaysia, Vietnam, some of these places finds ways to start rubber plantations. Rubber plantations start being taken over. French colonized Vietnam, and the way that you can see this flow of complete bloodbaths in the Amazon and in the Congo transferring over into Asia, and the violence and the forms of colonialism that are existing there. And then the synthesis, like the big thing, the big change that we see with all this stuff is that World War II forced synthesization because it cut off supply chains in a global economy that was vastly becoming more and more dependent. And there's some stuff I pull a lot for this discussion from this book, Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire. This book is really fucking good. But he makes a good point, and there's a couple of things worth quoting directly from him. At times, the Industrial Revolution could look a lot like a worldwide scavenger hunt for obscure tropical products. Like, there's an aspect of that almost sounds funny, but that's the reality of this. Like, the nature of the world that we know is the world that was shaped by Europe in a really fatalistic sense. So the Black Plague hits the world 1346 to 1353. We're seeing like a microcosm of that in some ways as with the pandemic. We're just seeing the global population has lost 3 to 4 million people, which again, all these pro-civilization arguments I've got in where people are like, well, everybody's going to die and you don't care. Couldn't even wear a fucking mask for a pandemic. So I don't really want to hear shit about it. It's pretty hard. And it's, we're saying this shit because we want to avoid having these mass die-offs and having a lot of people die. It could have been a lot worse. The Black Plague was much worse. The vast portions of majority of the population in a lot of parts of Europe died off, and it changed the relationship of the kind of economies and the kind of urban nature of a lot of what people were doing in Europe at that time. And a lot of people said, I don't want to do the shit work anymore. And it pushed the urge, which took at some time to really articulate, for finding slaves, for finding other parts of the world to do the shit work that we don't want to do anymore. And also we don't have the people that we did to just kind of keep throwing them at it. So it's always like kind of a really disturbing understory of civilization and colonialism and pandemics is that these deadly diseases decline populations and then shift the dynamics between them in ways that are always going to be more predatory. The slave trade was going back to 1,000 years into Africa. Muslim slave traders have going on, and it takes, it's not until the 15th century really, 16th century in a lot of ways, that starts to change a lot more, and it gets taken over by Europeans, and then of course you end up with the transatlantic slave trade. Horrific points in time, but that kind of labor, that need for resources that Europeanism has and that whiteness is really at its core entitled to, drives this whole force. And so what you end up seeing is that this part of globe, that Europe, this little speck at 1400, starts to shift its dynamics internally and look to the rest of the world as a resource to fill it, because it is relatively a small space. You look at a place like England, I mean, it's small compared to a lot of parts of the world. It is crazy that small power was able to attain as much control of the world as it did. But that's the nature of that situation. And also the colonial era, or what is typically considered the colonial era, comes up to much more recently than we want to admit. So also from Immerwahr, World War II is really what shifted a lot of these things. And it's where you start to see what he calls the emergence of the pointillist empire, which is the military, which, at the time, at the end of World War II, or the beginning of at the end of World War II, a third of what was considered America or the United States was off of what he called the logo map. We're not talking about mainland United States. We're not talking about Alaska. We're not talking about Hawaii. We're talking about a third of the empire is Malaysia, is all these different continents and all these different places, or not continents, but all these different countries and island chains that were considered parts of territories of the United States. The pointillist empire was that modernization and the synthesization of products and the creation of, banana republics, the creation of all these different political situations and empires and military situations and juntas, was that instead of just saying we own this and we're responsible for this, it's a lot like the transition from slavery to wage slavery in many ways, or many places, or debt peonage. Instead of owning this thing and being responsible for it, we have 1,000 military bases that we're placing in all these different spots throughout the world, and we're going to transfer the complete hegemonic control that we have through colonialism into hands that can run this management, that can manage these franchises of U.S. empire. And I mean, of course, there's very tricky situations to it, and there's parts about it that are like, Guam, Puerto Rico, they continue to be considered U.S. Unincorporated territories. So there's like ways in which this lives on. It's really grotesque. But what we were looking at is that colonialism is so recent and so in contemporary times that in 1940, 1 out of every 3 individuals on the entire planet was colonized. And by 1965, that number changed to 1 in 50. That's a vast change. And again, you want to talk about imperialism, and I mean, there's like a history here that really matters, and that the way that we talk about decolonization right now is vastly different than it was during these periods. And I mean, there's differences. I mean, like Frantz Fanon's version of decolonization, saying decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. The liberation of Algeria, much more in line with how it's being used within radical circles now. But also there was decolonization that was happening on the part of United States puppet governments to try and liberate colonies from other European nations so they could change the imperial relationship with them. And in all these interplays is how you see the transfer of power, the transfer of resources, the transfer of extractivist empires really just kind of flow back and forth between each other and go in this weird state from colony to imperialist. And of course, the underlying goal is the same. It's just a matter of the times and how things are being spoken about. And Adam Hochschild wrote this really good book about King Leopold's ghost. And this is a good thing to kind of compare this to, because King Leopold II of Belgium personally owned the Congo during the period of the rubber trade. This guy, I mean, it's kind of like an insane thing, but this is important to know because, I mean, we have to constantly be aware of and reintroduce the concept of lying and the white savior myth and these different narratives of power. He was saying at the time in which he was imposing this horrifically violent campaign in the Congo, where they were literally cutting off children's hands, cutting off people's hands for not getting enough rubber, extremely violent, just horrific violence. He was carrying out campaigns in Belgium saying that he was against slavery. Absolutely what was happening with slavery. You can see the same thing with Amazon. At a certain point when they changed the language, the colonialism to imperialism. Instead of being slaves or enslaved people, debt peonage. So now we've given you this thing and you owe us your life for it. It's the exact same system, just under a different name. But this flow, this transference of power needs to be able to look at it effectively. You need to be aware that the language can change and that you cannot ever trust the words of somebody in power. Never trust the words of somebody in control. I mean, that's a baseline thing about dealing with your personal life, dealing with political life, any of these things, any power dynamic that ever exists contains within it all aspects of lies. And you'll see that again and again. But this is what I want to kind of show. Like, this is what I want people to see. Where do these things come from? How is the interplay between all these things going to interact? And so one of the things I want to focus on here is talking about like guano. All right, we got one resource right here. And this is one that I'm going to focus on because guano is basically can be huge piles of composites of bird shit, but mostly it comes from bats. So it's like when people say bat shit crazy, guano crazy. The nature of the world is that we've gotten so used to having access to so many things that we don't pay attention to where these things come from in the history of these things. So you can pull any one of these threads, and the one I'm pulling is literally batshit crazy. It's guano. So to talk about guano, you have to understand the same kind of thing as far as like you would with the rubber trade, you would with transatlantic slave trade. The nature of extraction has always been built around finding different ways to get indigenous people enslaved or enmeshed in the systems long enough that they can do all the work for you. And that happened considerably with the guano trade, um, because you're seeing like in places like Peru and these islands outside Peru and Chile, and up off the northeast, which in fact like Ox, when you go up to like Nova Scotia, had massive piles of or like small islands or outputs of guano, and they're being used. And there's a whole history there as well. Um, Ox were driven to extinction because colonizers would literally just tear their feathers out of them while they're alive, and they're so filled with oil that they're using them for oil and also just burning them. And they killed off everything, and this was all being done by whalers who were working to fuel the same industrial system we're dealing with now. And the sperm whale was basically almost wiped out to extinction because it was a source of energy, a source of fuel. That's what you're looking at. You're looking at history of civilization, the inputs, and how these inputs shift and go back and forth. The American whaling fleet at its peak had over 700 whaling ships in 1846. And within about a decade of that, the number of sperm whales had died down so drastically that the entire trade shifted. And that's why you kind of see this thing. What effectively happened was that the Industrial Revolution caused such a difference in the way that food was being produced and distributed that it increased urbanization. Like all these different changes that have been happening over time, and you had seen in every civilization prior, is that the inclination is to centralize power, and that's where you start to see the buildup of the cities. The more city you need, or the more people you have, the bigger the city becomes. The more that centralized power becomes important and cosmic, related in a cosmology that is reflected in militaries. That's reflected in a different relationship to boundaries and to borders and to expansion. This is the nature of every civilization. They basically consume so much and find other ways to keep feeding this thing as though a biological organism until the world can no longer support it. And then at that point, it collapses. So guano becomes important because at this time, the changing relationship to agriculture and the changing relationship to industrialism means that the forms of agriculture that are happening require nitrates. So what had happened in a lot of these places, and there's a very difficult relationship to the nature of agriculture, how it expanded within settler colonies. But you had seen this massive killing off of all the nitrogen fixing aspects and all the nitrogen fixing things that would naturally exist in these environments. So it's kind of impossible to talk about guano without talking about the fact that passenger pigeons were being killed off throughout the 19th century in the Americas. And these flocks were massive. They were like one source of nitrogen for feeding the soil. But the entire cosmologies, the entire ecologies of these different areas were being massively impacted by expansionist empires. And you talk about the fur trade, and I'm going to, but let's ride out guano a little bit longer. We're skipping ahead a little bit in terms of time, but you can see I want to show how this flow goes back and forth. So guano is extremely high in nitrogen, and nitrogen fixing is a central part of, like, there's two things that make agriculture. One is the water, the flow of water. That's what separates agriculture from horticulture. The other is like the need for excessive inputs, because the forms of agriculture you see within industrial agriculture are monocropping, or even variations of like moving from a family farm to these massive operations, is completely denuding the area and then just planting everything on top of it and trying to make the most efficient system you can that's built on slave labor, maintained with slave labor, and then that just transfers in slight ways, as we currently see with how it's being produced and how it's being picked. But at this point in time, nitrogen becomes the number one thing that people need to get access to. Guano becomes a vast part of it, And then as soon as it does, it becomes one of the mass resources that we do not discuss. And in fact, a lot of histories and even a lot of like ecological green histories of civilization, of colonialism, they don't tend to talk a lot about guano. In fact, I think that like some of the main ones that are out there, Clive Ponting's Green History of the World and stuff like that, I don't even think in the index that includes guano. But this was a major thing. In 1856, the United States passes the Guano Act. The Guano Act makes it possible for any U.S. citizen that finds and identifies an island with guano on it is able to immediately claim that island as a U.S. colony. So this is a massive act of expansion. And again, this is part of the thing. It's like all the guano islands, I mean, they can be tiny, but there were at its peak, where's the number? I think it was like 856. Apologize, my notes are a little unclear here. Oh, right here. So the Guano Act made it possible any U.S. citizen discovered guano on an unclaimed, uninhabited island. That island would, at the discretion of the president, be considered as pertaining to the United States. And appertaining was a very interesting legal word to be using in that moment. But this thing became so massive. The first batch of islands were added to the United States in 1857. By 1863, the government annexed 59 islands. By the time the last claim was filed in 1902, the United States Oceanic Empire encompassed 94 guano islands. So that's from Imawar, who does talk about guano. But the entire nature of this system, the entire nature of this expanding colonial empire became reliant upon stripping all of this amassed guano as a resource, as a nitrogen fixing thing for the agriculture in the United States. And this created so much tension that on the edge of Peru and Chile, there were proxy wars being fought all the time. So between 1879 and 1884, there's the War of the Pacific. And so in Peru and in these islands off Peru, you had these massive guano concentrates. You had these massive guano islands. And then you go up into Chile and there's saltpeter. And saltpeter is a sodium nitrate. It's used effectively for the same thing. Both could be used for explosives, which become very important by the time you get to World War II. But in the buildup to World War II, you really see that. And so you have this entire process of colonialism dependent upon this resource, and then it's taking place and they're having these proxy wars. So this is a war that took place, or buildup that was taking place, and wars that were taking place between Chile and Bolivian and Peruvian combination. And again, this is the point where you're seeing the difference between settler empires or settler colonies and extractivist colonies. A lot of these places in South America in particular, of course, there is settler colonial elements. You do see massive cities in some of these places, and you do see massive empires, but for the most part, they were expanded and empowered ports for extraction and exporting of specific resources. So there's like a bit of a different relationship to it, but that's also been why the United States, in the transition from colonial empires to imperial empires, had very little difference in how they related to these places. And the degree of U.S. intervention in all these countries, once you go through the process of decolonization, once you go through the process of liberation and independence, you see this there, you see this in Africa. You're talking about a lot of puppet governments. You're talking about a lot of things like that. And that's why you see these kind of proxy battles that are taking place. Like the Guano Act and the expansion of the U.S. empire and the immediate claiming of ownerships over Guano Islands immediately changed the relationships in these areas. And it caused it so that you had the proxy war that was on the verge of being a world war over access to guano and over access to resources in Peru, Bolivia, Paraguay, Chile. And at the same time, that kind of thing continued up until World War II, and I mean, it continues to today. Like a lot of people, we don't talk about the Grand Chaco War. The Grand Chaco War is talking about the Grand Chaco, which is a plateau between Paraguay, Bolivia, and Argentina. And it was effectively a place where a lot of indigenous peoples had moved to. It was originally a hunting ground for a lot of indigenous societies on the tip of the Amazon. But as colonizers were coming in, more mobile people had just relocated there because the colonizers hadn't been able to get in part because of malaria, in part because they didn't have the resources, in part because they hadn't yet figured out what it is they were going to try and extract from that region. But because of those reasons, the Grand Chaco had never been as clearly defined in terms of borders as it had in other places. So the line between what was Paraguay, what was Bolivia, and what was Argentina had started to change. And then the idea that there was going to be oil found there caused the Grand Chaco War, which took place between 1932 and 1935. And it was the bloodiest war that happened in all the Americas, and nobody talks about it. The entirety of it was based around the idea that oil was there. And then once the war was declared and the boundaries were firmly set, they sent all the oil companies. This was a proxy war for oil companies run through governments. And by the time the war was over, they actually sent the prospectors in full and started to try to drill for oil, and there was none. Like, this is the tragedy of civilization. This is the tragedy of colonialism. The bloodiest war in the history of the Americas was over a resource that was believed to be there that was not there. And then, of course, a lot follows after this. And in my book in progress, The Gospel of Empire, I talk a lot about Aceh genocide, people of hunter-gatherers of Paraguay, and the relationship that missionaries have there and taking over for Stroessner, who's the longest running dictator in all of the Americas. His regime lasted for over 30 years, and he created a military state. The military state was involved in the system of slavery that took place all throughout Latin America, in particular, and the United States as well, of encomiendas, which is something we're seeing again, like with these flows, with all the cycles. The Catholic Church was one of the primary colonizers of the Americas. It was in other places as well, but the Catholic Church actually owned the property on which the church stood and the area around it. And they created encomiendas, plantations, and other places that could be called praying towns. The entire goal was to make slaves or enslave the indigenous peoples. And of course, they were sex trafficking the women and the girls, and vastly abusing everybody. But they were trying to colonize. This was an act of genocide, trying to do what Pratt had said he was doing in Carlisle, kill the Indian, save the man. They're trying to strip out every aspect by force, by horrific violence and brutality and force, all aspects of culture and relationship and understanding that these people had with the land and with the area, and to turn them into poor farmers, to bring them into the economy in a way that they could sustain the missions themselves, but then the missions themselves would sustain themselves off of extraction and exportation of resources. So, like, how does the Catholic Church become one of the richest institutions in the world? They're built on slavery, plain and simple. The same way any other colonial empire functions, they are solely there for the express purpose of owning, dominating that land for the purpose of clearing it for God and God's purpose, or what they would consider God's purpose. And it's fucking grotesque. It's really what it is. The changes in all these different ways and all these different terms and the terminologies that's used. But this is the core of it. In fact, you had the encomienda system, which is a plantation system, and then you had reductions. Reductions were like more of a prison camp. So they were meant for fugitives that had run away from enslaved indigenous people who had run away from the encampments, and they were considered hard to control, or populations that were non-cooperating. So I mean, like, you have these different aspects of prison colonies, and of course the parallel with that is the expansion of Europe at all these times. Not only was it based off of trying to expand and incorporate more resources, every one of these settler colonies, every one of these expansionist zones, and we're going down to the British control of India. You go down through the South Pacific, go down through Australia, New Zealand, through the Andaman Islands, a lot of places in South America, but even in the United States and Canada, these all started as penal colonies, first and foremost. And part of that was because penal colonies were effectively debt peonage in a way. They're closer to the system of like you can pay off your time by expanding this force, and there's a lot there. There's a lot to be said about it, but the nature of civilization's expansion, for all the piousness that people want to attribute to, some kind of honor to its brutality, like civilization is imprisoning so many people and forcing these people to take part in the expansion of the empire. Um, that's really just what it is. And it's just like it's disgusting, indefensible, horribly violent. But again, you can see in that very early stage, even the way that these hierarchies are tiered, the way that prisoners are treated in one way can be extremely brutal, but they're led to believe that the indigenous people there are going to eat them if they get away, like to create all these different ideas with narratives to change the way that people have perceived everything and the voraciousness with which they would be willing to take part in clearing land and expanding or participate in this system is reflective of the way that we see things now in every single regard. But you have this movement of just running the area dry. So the guano reserves get just decimated. So then it's not like it's just like now. It's like not like any point where somebody looks around and says, well, we have to have a different way of being. It's like, all right, well, where's the next resource for it? And the big impetus for the change here is in 1908, a guy named Huber synthesizes nitrates just in time for World War One, and it changes some of the relationships of the way that fertilizers go, and we go from fertilizers that come from guano to chemical fertilizers, which of course are also used as agents of war, agents of colonialism and expansionism. Like, you can't touch on any one of these parts without grabbing onto the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and showing this is how all these things flow. And you can even look at this aspect of it as like, okay, well, why were there so many enslaved people in the Americas, indigenous people, and then bring enslaved indigenous Africans over here? And the nature of it is that the encomienda reduction system was primarily being used by people that had a direct link on the indigenous peoples in that region, this kind of missionary conquest. There was just this violent focus on trying to still shift people and shift populations. So when you talk about the rubber trade, when you look at the missions that were taking place at that period, that 1880 period and 1915 period in the Amazon, the idea was very similar to how the slave trade was working and the transatlantic slave trade was working. So you're taking people from different regions and you're bringing them to different ports, and you're collecting them along the way, trading people along the way, and you're trying to combine people from different areas who speak different languages. And then, of course, you impose force upon them so that they can't speak their indigenous language or enact their customs at all. But a lot of cultures, a lot of cultural memory that exists now is a combination of these, like the merging of different indigenous peoples at these different outposts of empire, be it slavery, be it missionaries. And I mean, that's a very important thing. It's a part of like not encapsulating indigenous existence or life outside of civilization as being any one thing, because there's resilience in how these things go on. And I say resilience is a trait. It's not a compliment. It's not like I want to say, oh, it's so great how these people responded to horrific situations. I mean, they shouldn't have existed. These situations should never have existed. But it says a lot about the human spirit that even in these systems and these camps, people found some way to carry on. They found some way to relate to each other, and found a way to merge traditions in ways that absolutely draws everything together. But like at the same time that's happening, there is the complete elimination of everything else in the land. So when we're looking at the system at nitrates, the direct link that you can also see, you want to pull that direction. Another major source of nitrates at that time was from bison. So in terms of clearing the plains primarily of indigenous people, in terms of trying to starve them out, there was the explicit purpose of starving people out by targeting the buffalo. In 1867, Colonel Richard Irving Dodge of the U.S. military says, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." They were active campaigns of extermination. At the exact same time they were targeting bison, they were trying to expand agricultural processes and pastoral processes and bring cattle out. Try agriculture, of course, they had killed off all the passenger pigeons, and we kill off all the bison. Then it changes the ecology of the land, and you can't do row crops, but there can in many places. You can have cattle, and the cattle, like taking over the West, has been a massive movement since. But this served a number of processes. You can't just say it's like the bison were wiped out for one reason or another. The bison were wiped out for the reason of colonialism. It's the same reason indigenous people were being forced off, like killed and relocated. I mean, the ties between these things are direct. So the irony is you're clearing out the irony of the situation is killing off the people. You're killing off the animals. You're killing off the ecology, and then all of a sudden this grassland, this plains land that would have been ideal for grazing cattle is turning desert. Is the soil doesn't work with you anymore. There's been a lot said and a lot done about the impacts of grazing animals upon the ecology. And I mean, that's like, I don't know if everybody here is any involvement with any of this stuff, but looking at grass with beef, mob grazing, you can see within the plains how with large herds of animals constantly moving, they'll eat the top 5 to 10% of grasses and then trample the rest. And what it does is it creates like a kind of microbiome or a microecology within those trampled grasses, which, you know, there's a lot of life that exists, and it can really open up and expand the potential for other species to come in, the ground dwelling species come in, more insects, more life. But primarily what it does is it causes the grasses that don't go into a state of shock and put all their energy into growth, and instead they grow roots. You grow roots, you grow soil, and then the entire nature of water retention changes. I mean, the ecology of colonialism is erasing the entire ecology that actually exists there. And it's like the way that we understand the plains, the way we understand a lot of these areas, we see them much more as desertified because we drain the water out, we drain everything out of there, and then we kill off all the species that were existing there, and this entire system shifts. And so when you're looking at that, and I mentioned mob grazing, it's not just like, you know, I'm saying, oh, this is the great thing that everybody's trying to say it is. Like, there are ecological benefits to it, but primarily what it's showing is the natural ecology that would be happening here, huge herds constantly coming through, had a completely different relationship with the land and with the soil. And it changed the way that water would change. It changed the way that the climate would have been impacted by the amount of growth and by the amount of carbon being cycled and the amount of nitrogen that would have been fixed just by having animals come through and the populations that that area could have supported. Is a vastly different picture than what we're dealing with now, which is another reason why it's like people talk about like, well, how's everybody going to survive? It's like, well, if you let the shit grow back, then it's going to be a rapidly different picture. If people stop fucking cutting grass in their yard and start thinking about wild ecologies or bringing back more of this native ecology, things naturally start to change in drastic ways. And I have personally seen, even with mob grazing in 2 years, the water retention along a property line with conventional mob grazed fields, how different it is. I mean, it's very radical. We can greatly overstate our own role in things like using nitrogen, have bolstered the idea that we have more control and more ability in changing these and shaping landscapes than we would like to think. Of course, humans do exist within that land relationship. Humans do have a role within these societies. I'm not trying to say any of that's not true, that there's not degrees of involvement in shaping them. Just that, like, our relationship from an industrial perspective innately shifts the scope, and it greatly shifts who could be considered or involved in all these different processes. That's one major reason, as if it needs to be said, why indigenous people are saying land defense involves indigenous existence. It shouldn't have to be said. Like, yes, they're part of this ecology, they're part of this landscape, they're part of this. This is the relationship they have established, fought for, killed for, died for. Like, this is what they're fighting for. This is why land back is like the number one thing for saying, how do you undermine the empire or you undermine the American empire? It's like, first off, nobody can be trusted with power. but our power is based off of a power dynamic, and it's an innately different thing. We see relationship. We relate to land as property. Um, that's not a relationship; it's a power dynamic. So destabilizing the nature and existence of the power relationship, like if the stuff needs to be justified, which it shouldn't, but just to explain it a little more, like that's that power, that's that situation, that's what we're looking at, that's what that call is about, in some regards. And of course the most clear regard of it is like land back is just land back, like there's, it doesn't need further justification. But of course our view is so scattered that we don't see all these different relationships, and instead it's just like, well, this is property, how do we raise the value, how do we raise carrying capacity, how do we raise production value? It's like, well, our entire approach is fucked. And that's why we're having to go through all these different steps to try and understand from a relationship base or an ecological base how all these different parts play together. And so, like, the expansion of empire and the eradication, of course, of indigenous peoples, but also of bison, and not just bison, but talking about wolves, coyotes, um, Department of Agriculture, the wildlife control, wildlife services, they exist solely to remove predators from the equation to keep the ecology out of massive swaths of land. They're doing to protect ranchers ostensibly. But there's also elements of the depredation laws and the depredation programs that were just like this issue with the bison. Like the goal was that the expansion of agriculture, in every step, and you're talking about, I mean, you could be talking about Kalahari, and we're talking about the Northwest Plains, we're talking about the plains going into Canada, or it is now Canada, or you're talking about Argentina, all these different areas. Um, the expansion of cattle and the expansion of grazing lands, the expansion of these agricultural programs is the core of it. And so the depredation laws that were being used to enforce wildlife services and the eradication of coyote, of wolves, of predators, of bears, cougars, the exact same laws are being used to clear the lands of indigenous populations, particularly in the like the American Southwest. Talking about Giancarlo, Apache, like they were using the same terms for killing wolves and killing people. And I mean, it's really kind of disgusting. And it's like, that's why the program ended up being shipping people back and forth, because what was also happening at that time to expand empire out in the Americas was they're expanding the railroad, and bison, huge herds of bison were ruining tracks. Indigenous people were continually taking down the railways, which is again another part of like the flip side of this ecological conversation of seeing civilization or colonialism as an ecological being, is by understanding the roots of it and understanding how it functions, it changes the perspective on like how do you target it, like urban resistance, instead of looking at targeting civilization from like how do you take over it from a revolutionary standpoint, from a political scope, how would you take on the military. And instead of looking at it from that perspective, it takes on this other perspective, which is innate to indigenous resistance, but also has been a part of a lot of like guerrilla warfare and things like that, is to understand how fragile this empire is by having its reliance be on all these different outposts and all these different things. So like the existence of bison was a threat to the actual trails and tracks being made to sustain the expansion of progress by using railways. And they use the railways, in fact, as a way to hunt bison. And there's like pretty grotesque aspects of that, and pretty, I mean, obviously very grotesque. But some in particular is Major General Philip Sheridan, who is the primary colonel responsible for removing indigenous peoples from the plains and relocating to reservations. Like this asshole went on bison hunts with William Buffalo Bill Cody, like famous, just upheld in American mythology and stuff like that as being frontiersmen and this whole frontier ideology, which is a whole thing. But they were like living this luxurious life and doing this. Like there was they went out, Buffalo Bill and Sheridan. One of the trips they took to exterminate bison, they had 25 wagons. They had cooks, linens, china. Their tents were carpeted. They were carrying ice chests for cooling their wine and like living this luxurious thing. And I mean, like one of the crazy things about this whole situation is like they weren't eating the bison; they were just killing them, the fur trapping, or sending the hides over to England to be utilized. They were letting things die, and then people were coming back through and picking the bones for nitrogen. They're going to store it and use it for fertilizer. The better bones of it were being taken and crushed and shipped off to Europe to be making fine bone china. And so, like, I didn't know about this. I found about it last night. Uh, Dana, I'm gonna say Dana Glaxon. I apologize if I'm getting it wrong, but she had a display. She's hung Papa Lakota, and she had done this display in 1997, and then a more recent version of it, and it's called I think Fine Bone China or Buffalo Bone China, um, and had done this performance art where it smashed all this European English China, the fine China that had been made from the dried bones left over from this complete onslaught. But the iron, not the irony, but the horrific side of the situation is like British elites were literally eating on like the fine china that was being used by Cody, Buffalo Bill Cody, and by Sheridan, and all these assholes involved with expansionism. They're literally eating their like luxurious cooked prepared meals off of the plates made from the bones of the extermination, of the ecocide, of the genocide. And their entertainment was indigenous people that were trapped throughout the world and brought around. Buffalo Bill, you know, also was taking these people around as like a freak show. Like entertainment. There's all these different aspects of it. I mean, it's just really disgusting because you can see all the different sides of colonialism coming into play in each one of these things. And the nature of it is that expansionism, that frontierism, which is a really good book that came out, actually won a Pulitzer, Greg Grandin's End of the Myth. Really good book. Like especially this and Everwar's book together, they make a very fine pairing. But he talks a lot about the nature of expansionism and kind of the frontier violence that we saw in the Americas was really about how do you create a blow off for like these poor white people or people who would become white or are white in the settler process. And it focuses a lot talking about the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, but all these different aspects of how white supremacy is the foundation upon which this country lies, unquestionably, indisputably, and we can see that in every regard. But like constantly having to satiate this thing. So like when you look at the colonial war, or I'm sorry, the Civil War, is one of the instances where the story that's being told is a fight against slavery. It's one of the instances too where supposedly white supremacists lose the war, but white supremacy wins. There's the Confederates that had been in those wars are simply moved from one place to another. They tried to reestablish Confederacy in South America. And in other places, they were just pushed out west. And that's why you have so many white supremacists in places like Oregon. They just got the promise of like, if you continue this fight, if you carry on these battles, then you get this land, you get this situation. You just constantly see this shifting around, and the idea of the frontier and the idea of expansionism being this strange relationship of being very overt in terms of colonialism, but very explicit in terms of how it separates different parts and times of the American story and the American lineage and the idea of progress in ways that try to make these parts seem separate, try to satiate these desires and try to separate all these different elements in ways that really don't make any sense. And you can see the continuities. You see, like, this is when we talk about the origins of the police were in deputizing slave catchers, slave patrols. You see the origins of the Border Patrol is the institutionalization of the KKK. The first clearing of the border is relatively recent between the US and Mexico, but the first actual barrier that was created along the US-Mexico line was repurposing the fences posts and the fencing that were used in the internment of Japanese American and Alouettes people during World War II. Like, there's a constant flow in very strict terms in terms of resources, in terms of the actual substances used in maintaining colonial empires. And again, you can't avoid these things. It's like the whole point of this, the whole point of these discussions and trying to like start and pill these things out. And I mean, again, you could go on forever with this. Like everything that's happening, everything, like there's probably 50 items in a cell phone that go back and they can be traced through these exact same steps. And I had mentioned that the Indigenous Action podcast, the newest one that I listened to last night. I hadn't known, like there is apparently Musk and Tesla are building a massive plant in Nevada. And the reason it's happening in Nevada is because they don't have to worry about the taxing and the movement of lithium, because they plan on mining massive lithium deposits in Nevada. And of course, these lands are all sacred places for indigenous people. They're all the home, the relationships that exist, these land relationships that exist, but are just shifting. It's like just pushing people off, eliminating people as much as possible, and trying to kind of create these barriers from the past. And the exact same processes are constantly being played out. And that's the core of this. There's no point in civilization at which anything has intrinsically changed. The only thing that has changed is the scale and the amplification of it. And the reality of it is that peoples knew at all times about the horrors of civilization, the horrors of colonialism. And we have these ideas implicit by these liberal ideals and leftist ideals and things like that, and these progressive ideas that we're getting better, that we're learning more, that the world is a better place. And that's a story that we have to tell, because then we have to be able to say, well, judge these people by the standards of the time and not of ours. It's like, one, that's about erasure. Like that's complete white erasure, because an enslaved person didn't have to be told at the time they were enslaved that they were a human being, had a right to exist. Like, so right there, the enslaved people, the victims of colonialism, the victims of oppression, had no question about their value. We just, as the narrative of this, as a whiteness-based, white supremacist-based empire, just erases that perspective. But people knew. I mean, there's been people who've been talking about, like, again, this is why Leopold was having to say he was against slavery at the time in which he was enslaved an entire chunk of the world in Africa. It was going on and people found out about it, but people believe them. They believe in politicians. Nothing's changed in that regard. There's plenty of people who don't, and then plenty of people who do. The predication of power is based off how many people believe the lie enough that they keep it in power, they keep going at it. I do have to pause for 1 second. I'll be right back. I apologize about that, but it did just start pouring out, and I have a wet dog who's not very happy with me. But I apologize. So I should state at this point, it is 4 o'clock. I do kind of put these at 2 hours. They do tend to go. Yes. In case you did not believe me. Sorry. Okay. So I don't know how people are looking at time. I could definitely continue going on, but I do want to kind of open up here and see if people so far have questions or comments before I do so. Yes. So do you have any recommendation for resource on the ecological aspect of biodiversity being changed / damaged by colonial civilization versus what could be? Also, reiterating that whiteness is not a culture, but a lack thereof. It's not an ethnic group or culture. It is based on power, colonialism, capitalism. Exactly. Whiteness is not a culture. It is a power dynamic. So recommendation for resources. So I want to preface that I get a little wary. I do deal a lot with like ecological stuff. Naturally, read a lot of books. I've recommended a lot of books. I always get nervous about recommending books and things like that sometimes because right now the world is a shifting place, and people are really letting the veneer come off, um, as far as where they stand. Like two classic books on the situation we could look at be like Changes in the Land by William Cronin and Ecological Imperialism by Alfred Crosby. I do want to state um, I'm not giving a wholehearted endorsement to these, and I haven't dealt with them in full in a while. There's a thing that I do want to address. Actually, I've got this here too, and I want to pull it out. Coyote America, Dan Flores, really good book. But even here, it's a slight mention, and some of the other ones deal with more. A lot of the ecological stuff that exists has this kind of deep ecological aspect to it that is inherently problematic. And that is that a lot of it is predicated on the Bering Strait theory, and also piggybacked on the Bering Strait theory is Pleistocene overkill. Pleistocene overkill has been wildly disproven in many ways. Like I said, Vine Deloria Jr.'s Red Earth, White Lies is a really good book on that. So there's that book, the Paulette Steves. I think it's the Indigenous Paleolithic of North America. I didn't bring it down. I apologize. It's a new book that I'm really excited about. Like countering that perspective. One of the things I really thought, just to be clear, with Paulette Steve's book, I was expecting a lot more in terms of dismissing the Pleistocene overkill theories. There's about a page or two that deal with it at all. And at first I was kind of like, well, all right. But then it's like, you know what though? Good for her. That's fucking awesome. Like, the best thing you could do for a completely racist bullshit discredited theory is, instead of like giving it all this space and heading, all right, let's work through and disprove it, is just to say the entire nature of this argument and the entire recognition of indigenous existence on this continent disproves the theory in every other way. I don't need to spend any time disproving a thing that doesn't exist. And there's all these different kind of ideas, like the Pleistocene overkill stuff. It's a bunch of different aspects to it. The Pleistocene overkill arises as a reaction to the increasing presence of feminism and ecology in the social sciences in the 1960s. Like the changeover that was happening there within a lot of these different realms of like just being strictly patriarchal colonial institutions, and saying like, you know what, we're missing a huge part of the picture. Like starting, you can go back to the stuff like Man the Hunter Conference, work of Julian Stewart. You know, I mean, not to give all the credit to white people or anything like that, or to these institutions, but to say that there was a conversation happening with these institutions to say the nature of how we've understood the world, the nature of looking at hunter-gatherer societies as patriarchal, patriarchal, and patrilineal societies where the hunter is king and stuff like that. It's like, we've got this wrong. All right, this is totally different. Our understanding of these things is wrong. And the relationship of people to the land itself is something that there's people coming from Western cultures and saying like, yeah, I'm going out in the field and I'm not seeing what I'm doing. And again, this is not in any way trying to be like apologetic about anthropology, apologetic about these fields, nor to imply that this was a universal thing. This was a movement happening within these strands and was being addressed from that front. And in reaction to that, you get paleocon kind of folks, right-wing folks, and are like, well, in response to this, it's like, well, if we're going to sit here and talk about colonialism, we're going to talk about rights, indigenous rights and indigenous existence, then let's go ahead and look at the situation. We don't understand fully, like there's all these different theories, and actually the Pleistocene overkill theory was a minor theory in even up to the 50s and 60s. I lived in Missouri for a while, and there was some museums that still had very dated very dated displays talk about Pleistocene beings, or like the animals that exist in the Americas during the Pleistocene. Barely any mention in those displays of the Pleistocene overkill theory. I found that completely fascinating. Like looking through some of this anthropological stuff, looking through some of the archaeological stuff from the 40s, 50s, 60s, prior to this theory really being pushed out there, it's like, maybe that humans had a role in this, but we understand that there was an extinction event caused by climate change that caused these die-offs, and that yeah, possibly humans had some role in it, or but we know humans had hunted some of these megafauna and some of these Pleistocene or Paleolithic beings, but it was really like a minor note, if anything. And instead, ecologists and particularly environmentalists really kind of grafted onto this whole thing of saying like, well, this deep ecology kind of perspective of saying that industrialism has issues and stuff like that, but instead of taking a deeper look into the foundations of civilization, the foundations of industrialism, took this really kind of topical thing and been like, okay, well, the population bomb, boom, Paul Ehrlich and all these other people, these foundational ecologists and deep ecologists took this perspective of saying like the problem started happening when the population exploded. And for a long time, I had said like anarchoprimitivism and deep ecology were like chicken and the egg as far as where the population, like deep ecology is like population is the issue, and anarchoprimitivism is like population explosion is a result of agriculture. Um, and I mean, just to throw out there, I've changed my relationship with anarchoprimitivism, and I've written some stuff about it. I put a lot out there about moving away from the term and the kind of questions it asked, and saying that there's a different relationship now, and I focus more on talking about primalanarchy, and I've got a lot of things available as far as that goes. So I don't want to dwell on it here, but at the time and how I was articulating it, and how I've been articulating it, is to say it's like the way that you look at the population is a much different thing. And realistically, in terms of this trajectory of anarcho-primitivism, primal anarchy, it's like, you know, focusing on population 100% of the time is going to lead towards, if you're going to say like there's going to be some kind of praxis built around seeing population numbers as the problem, leads to fascism. And that's been what's been happening. The rise of ecofascism has to do with the idea that like too many humans is innately the problem, and that humans are inherently going to destroy everything, which is what the Pleistocene overkill is trying to say. There's different ideas that are kind of like drafted in all that. There's even one that was like based on overhand flaking technique, saying that there was marauding bands of hunter gatherers that came out of Africa 70,000 years ago, and every 20,000 years since, they went into an area and killed everybody. It's like, okay, no, but like there's no cultural trait that's ever existed that suppressed for 20,000 years and then reemerges. It just like doesn't happen. It's like sci-fi kind of stuff, but like the idea came about from ecologists, environmentalists trying to say is like, well, humans are the problem here, so we need to focus on numbers, and that's why so much so about Pleistocene rewilding is about bringing back, trying to revive in genetic engineering the mastodon or like anything like that. And it's anti-indigenous in every sense of the word, but this stuff is very prevalent in ecological writing. So like Dan Flores, I think that book is excellent. He does make mention of it. It's like kind of like a passing thing. And but all the stuff that's been written, I do like to preface it, and I do increasingly feel the need to preface that while some of the stuff exists, there is that kind of question. But then there's also stuff like there's really good work being done in it, and there's also a lot of indigenous perspective, traditional ecological knowledge coming about, and basically the entire. I mean, this is a subject. This has never been like missing from indigenous narratives. It's talking about the relationship of animals around and the way the roles of animals and the cognizance of other beings within an ecosystem. And so, I mean, like that's been a persistent thing. So, ironically, a lot of ecologists will like cite it and reference it and not make the connection. But I do want to mention Eager, uh, Ben Goldfarb, relatively new book that I really liked. Um, Man, something I go on for another 5 hours. I would incorporate more of talking about like the beaver and the shaping of landscapes. Like this book is really good in terms of saying that the idealized version of natural landscapes that we've gotten within this culture, within this narrative, and it's again one of the reasons why I focus on stuff, because it's kind of in some ways trying to work actively to undermine these narratives. and open up the perception to be able to hear other perspectives even better. A step I think shouldn't have to be taken, but of course it kind of does in some regards. But like the expansion into the Americas, from the Northeast was innately different from how it would happen in different places, um, because the expansion was happening with French fur traders, and the nature of that colonization had a lot of the same impacts. You get down to the settler societies in the East Coast, things look a little bit different, but that extractivist empire that was being established with the French, the expansion of the Haudenosaunee, and the expansion of the fur trade and the trapping of beavers in areas like the Northeast where beavers were extremely prevalent, it started to change and shift more as you went further west. But that idealized sense about what pristine ecologies, landscapes look like, that even early colonizers were portraying, was a landscape that had already been changed because the beaver had largely been wiped out for the fur trade. And that's like a really kind of crucial thing. That's another one of these ways of seeing in an ecological sense, because we don't really understand or give presence to like the productionist view that we can have, or the productionist view that we can have with the landscape, based off of like a very idealized agrarian kind of fly fisher view of streams that removed the beaver already. And those landscapes would be vastly different. The way the water would be retained throughout the plains, the Midwest, the Southwest, vastly different had the beaver not been exterminated. And of course, like this all plays a lot into the questions about ecology and colonialism, because Canada was Rupert's Land, which was owned by the Hudson Bay Company, which was just fur trappers. I mean, Canada, it's not like America is necessarily a whole lot different, but Canada is really just like a fur company that made a railway. I mean, John McDonald, the asshole who founded Canada, was effectively the guy who got the railway built between the fur empire and the logging empire. And then they created this landscape for that would be primed for oil, and that's where things have gone. But the fur empire is one of the main reasons, one of the main ecological needs and ecological aspects that drove that colonialism. Logging, of course, being the other. There's a lot that's written on that, and a lot that's really good about that. But I guess the long story short is like there's different perspectives, and I'm sure you can imagine hearing me talk about this. I have a lot of conflicted elements in talking about books that I read that I found were very ecologically important, because they try to strip out these different aspects of the indigenous relationships, indigenous perspectives, or even necessarily will rely upon this kind of flawed perspective of like humans as the innate destroyers, rather than civilization and colonialism being this very external form of brutality that takes over. I'd like to recommend more books in that regard. But I just have to admit, like, there's kind of a lot of things I feel the need to like go back through. I can say like, there's the work of Gay Bradshaw I've been really supportive of. She wrote a book called Carnivore Minds, and it's talking about the social animal, the nature of other social animals in terms of colonialism, and draws direct links talking about trauma and how trauma has been impacted and looked at in a lot of different ways as far as indigenous societies, drawing those parallels, and also saying very overtly like the indigenous experience, the indigenous storytelling that surrounds that relationship is much more overt and much more aware of it. And there's a lot there, and I have to apologize too. My recall is a little foggy whenever it's raining because of limes, which is another combined issue with the entire thing. Carnivore Minds? Was that the one you're asking about? So I'm responding to the chat. So people who have inevitably listening to this will not see that. G.A. Bradshaw. So my wife is asking what your thoughts are on a fair trade system for goods. That book I can recommend. Yes, Carnivore Minds is what I said. Confessions of an Eco Center, Fred Pierce. So the title sucks. I hate it. I don't like it. But tracking down the sources of my stuff, the byline is much more accurate for what it is. And like I said, there's a lot of things that are like a lot of these single kind of topic books or histories of a particular food or a particular substance. I think these are all really good. And I think that there's a lot of things in them. I mean, like, I'm not saying that I agree with the authors who are pitching it so that it can be a top seller, who are saying, like, this one thing is the key to history. It's like, all right, it's key to the 5 minutes that needed to happen between the other 5 minutes. So kind of like take it with a grain of salt, put it in context, but at the same time, there's truth to the elements of that stuff. Like, there's a book about bananas called Bananas. It's great. It's got a lot of history of colonialism and imperialism in it. But this book, he takes a look at individual products that were in his household, and as somebody who's an ecologist, Fred Pierce has written a lot about climate change, and like tries to track down and go through to understand the systems that are involved and what it takes to get each thing that goes into, like I said, like a cell phone's got like 50 rare earth minerals. What are the things that are coming from, and where are they coming from? Where are they going? And when you look at these systems of fair trade versus like free market, the differences are minimal. He talks in here about fair trade coffee, and I if I'm not mistaken, I forget his name. There's a major one of the food books that brought like local food stuff. I'm blanking on it right now. I apologize. I think he might have mentioned coffee too, but I'm being extremely vague and I apologize. But like looking through and walking through these different systems and seeing the colonial nature of them, you can see that the dynamic that's created by the fair trade market is basically set by the free trade market, and the degrees of difference, particularly when you're looking at something like coffee, you're looking at chocolate. Those are two big ones that he goes through. Those are two big ones that have been examined very thoroughly. The difference is negligible. I'm not saying it to dismiss it necessarily. I'm just saying that, like, as a thing of like people trying to find ways to have ethical consumption, you can't have ethical consumption. It doesn't happen. Everything has costs. Everything has consequences. It's the wrong kind of perspective. I mean, there's people joking right now, the ocean's on fire. It's like, was it the plastic straws? It's like, no, it's a fucking industrial system. Like, nothing, no individual choice you're making is going to be as anywhere near as big or as anything compared to what the entire industrial system is doing. But I do have to say, in relationship to that, like, kind of one of the things I want to draw out, and this is something I talk about. I've had a couple podcasts, the Primalanarchy podcast, where I have talked about genocide, and I mentioned it earlier. But there's a whole history to it, and there's a lot in the book Gospel of Empire that I'm writing that really goes into detail in terms of talking about yerba mate. So yerba mate was one of the big exports in the 1800s and 1900s. There's the whole thing that I think I mentioned Sweetness and Power as one of the books that really like focuses on power dynamics and undermining history. Sidney Mintz. It's like a really good book looking at the impacts of sugar and the sugar trade. I believe he does talk a bit about fair trade stuff in there as well. But talking about shifts in like British sugar consumption or Western sugar consumption and how that shifted throughout the world. And like yerba mate has become a fringe kind of like left liberal fashion drink. Effectively, like hipsters love it. Like Guayaki brand yerba mate is a hipster brand. And they have influencers and shit like that. You can buy it at health food stores. If you're on Denver, I've seen billboards for it. That undermines the fact that yerba mate is a tea leaf that does have caffeine. It could compete with green tea, and at times, because of the impacts of war, the trade relationships with China, and things like that, like the British Empire has shifted drastically on the sources of things it gets. And of course, the British Empire strongly upholds tea over coffee. But if you're sending people into the factories, you want some kind of stimulant. Beer, coffee, yerba mate, tea, all these different things play that role. Again, you just kind of like see this flow back and forth. But that was a predominant export of extractivist empires in the 1800s and the 1900s, and it kind of dies down. But one of the things you have to look for is that with this flow, how things kind of like come back or return, or how these poor towns kind of shift and what those resources can be. And they can be as trivial as a drink. But when we look at the global economy, you look at consumption, nothing is too small or too trivial for undermining or taking part in this entire system. And so when you talk about, like, in the case of the Aceh, I'll try to do like a shorter version of this. They were the Guarani Empire, Tibi Guarani Empire had been involved with exporting yerba mate, and then the Aceh were nomadic hunter gatherers outside of it, and they had been trying to evade colonizers. And they're nomadic hunter gatherers. They are still in many ways nomadic hunter gatherers. And so they had been able to move further into the Chaco region, to move around more to avoid the settlements that the Tibi Guarani Empire was not able to avoid. It was a horticulturalist society, and it had already been relatively rooted in particular landscapes in ways that the impact with colonizers and conquerors was innately different. The difference is that it meant that the Tibi Guarani Empire was more apt for outright warfare and resistance with settlers and with colonizers, but it changes the impact of when people come back. And again, talking about quinine, talking about anti-malarial medications, talking about these different ways in which Europe was able to move further and further inland into the Amazon and into all these different areas. All these things kind of play in a role. So the goal of the missionaries, the goal of the colonizers, this was Stroessner. We're talking about Paraguay. We're talking about, they were doing what they called Indian hunts, where they were going in and just taking indigenous people, taking children, taking women, taking girls, putting them in this sex trade, and using them as servants in different places. But they were also doing this encomienda system and reductions. And Stroessner had towards the end of his regime when it was being seen about the encomiendas and the slave raids, they took that attention by trying to turn over the goal of running these settlements, these forced settlements for Aceh and other hunter-gatherers and other indigenous people, over to New Tribes missions. New Tribes missions being run, the campaign was being, Cecilia Baez, which was one of the main ones, was being run by missionary Jim Stolz. It's a fucking scumbag. He took part in the same efforts to do these Indian hunts, to hand off. I mean, for being a missionary, just handing women. The missionaries always take part. All these missionaries take part in pushing girls, particularly into the sex trade. And sadly, it's one of the reasons why it seems like Catholic priests tend to prey on boys. They're the ones that are left behind. And so what ends up happening is that this is being handed off to New Tribes missions, and they're trying to do this under they're moving from the dictatorship to specifically Christian hands. And the idea was that this is taking place under a whole other thing. And of course it wasn't any different. Like, the die-offs among the Aceh were extraordinary. And by the time some of the anthropologists that got there, Pierre Clastres, who's an anarchist, at the end of the 60s, by the time he got there, and Louis Monzel and the journalist, holy shit, I'm forgetting his name. Norman, Norman Lewis, who's a major writer. He wrote a book called Missionaries where he talks about it. Of course, I talk about it in the book I'm writing too. By the time they got there and started ringing the alarm about, like, the fact that the population had gotten down to 30 people, the international community started to make an outcry about it and started to talk more about it and calling it genocide. They ended up putting a book called Genocide in Paraguay. And it becomes like a bigger thing. It catches a lot of attention. Of course, not much is necessarily done about it, but it starts to catch international attention. So one of the things that ends up happening with that attention is that Kim Hill, who's an anthropologist, he finds out about it through cultural survival. So cultural survival, uh, it's an NGO, and it's supposed to be about indigenous rights and indigenous existence. It's very different from a group like Survival International. Survival International is very much about um, like removing like fighting missionaries talking about making first contact and forcing settlements. Cultural survival is much more of a liberal NGO. And so what ends up happening is that Kim Hill reads about all this and he goes out there, and he effectively is given some of the control from New Tribes Mission, and it's again whitewashed. It goes from dictatorship to New Tribe missions, and then it's being given over in some degree to Kim Hill. And Kim Hill goes into it knowing that genocide happened, and he ends up writing this ethnography, Aceh Life History, which is a huge book and also really fucked up. So when you see Steven Pinker and all the people who extrapolate off of Steven Pinker talking about life in hunter-gatherer societies was more violent than life within civilization, they're working off works like Kim Hill. And what ended up happening is that those people who were counting those numbers, the numbers that they were taking as far as homicide rates in indigenous societies, particularly hunter-gatherer societies, in these times of supposed first contact, and everybody, all the anthropologists, bullshitters, wanted to say, like, I'm the first person to interact with these people. These people were pristine and the society hadn't been touched or contacted. This bravado, it's bullshit. It didn't ever happen. But in terms of this particular case, what he ends up doing is he ends up taking the numbers and figuring out the homicide rates based off of everything from violence that happens at these settlements because of like situations having deteriorated and the means for conflict resolution being on, which are, you know, valid numbers and or like they're things that happen as a result of colonialism. But specifically, they took the number of people who were killed by colonizers. People were killed by loggers. People were killed by slave hunts. People killed in slave hunts. They took all those numbers to create a homicide rate that was famously like for when you talk about the Bushmen, where Richard Lee had found the homicide rate was famously be considered as equal to Detroit in the 60s. And so like this kind of argument was being used to undermine this rising tenet to say is like everything we know about hunter gatherers, everything we know about indigenous people as settlers, as white people is wrong and innately flawed. And so this backlash kind of happens. You get people like Napoleon Chagnon and eventually Steven Pinker who come out and they create situations, they create tensions, they create horrific colonial situations. And a person like R. Brian Ferguson is an anthropologist who's done really amazing work, wrote an essay called The Blood of Leviathan, which is I strongly recommend. It's academic, it's a little bit hard to get through, but he's not the most ardent in terms of writing and approach. And he's also not trying to remove consequences and talk about it in a cold, articulate, academic way in that regards. But there are people talking about it, but they start to extrapolate colonial situations, colonial frontier violence, and turn that into an argument against the people being violently suppressed and violently supported and pushed into these settlements. So Kim Hill ends up presenting this information, and he's basically going out there saying that he found out about cultural survival and he found out about this genocide. He's going to go out here, and he goes and he's like, you know what? It's not, sorry, Kim Hill. R. Brian Ferguson. Somebody's asking about the name. I'm guessing R. Brian Ferguson is probably the name in question. So he ends up going out there and seeing all this stuff, and he ends up becoming a part of the system. He becomes a part of this. He gets put in charge of some of the camps. He gets put in charge of some of the reserves. And in Aceh Life History, he ends up making this argument, and this is articulated again and again in Western views of or perspectives or histories, ethnographies, especially ethnohistory. James Axtell is one of the big people involved in this. Where they end up doing is they end up saying, and this is from Kim Hill, and it's really fucking insane, is that the Aceh, despite the fact that they were wiped out down to 30 people, and they did manage to rebound in a bit, but like that was not genocide, because if that was genocide, then what was happening out throughout the entire Americas was genocide. And basically, that's too much genocide. Like, that is the most fucked up argument I've ever heard against calling something genocide, calling it exactly what it is. We're talking about, again, 50 to 100% die offs on standards, and the average being about 90% die offs based on contact. Like, that's unequivocally genocide, unequivocally intentional. And the reason they get down to it is to say, well, it was a side effect of the settlement process, and the settlement contact process was innately going to happen. Like, the approach of cultural survival is that contact is inevitable. And that, I mean, there's degrees of reality to that, but there's also like the side that you're taking when you say that is like, well, we should make the contact as good as it can be. So what ends up happening, again, this is hard to make a short version of it, but I'm also very furious about it, is that Kim Hill is put in charge of trying to find a program that's going to give some rights ostensibly back to Aceh people. And what that ends up being is a fucking plantation. So the Goyaki brand yerba mate, and I've put this in the book, and it's, I mean, it's not published obviously, but I did talk about it on the podcast. Goyaki brand yerba mate specializes in fair trade yerba mate. It is one of the largest suppliers of fair trade, supposedly fair trade yerba mate. It gets almost all of its yerba mate from that plantation. And the amount that it gives back, they actually had the numbers on there. So just so we're very familiar too, a lot of the terms that are given for tribes, and it's one of the reasons for focusing more on saying band names instead of tribal names, is that a lot of the tribal names are typically given by sometimes enemy societies or enemy bands and stuff like that. So the words are coming from another language, and they're often insults. So the name Goyaki is a Tupi-Guarani name that's an insult for the Aceh, and it means rabbit river rats. And like, that's horrible. But the reason they chose Goyaki for the company is because they didn't have to pay any likeness rights, because it's not actually the name of the people would refer to themselves as. I mean, it's grotesque. The name is actually an insult. But I called them out, and I put it on there, and I know they saw it because they accidentally liked the post on Instagram before they must have listened to it. But I went through their financials, and what they're doing is that they're paying one full-time salary for a plantation manager, and then a partial salary for an assistant, which I don't know, but I do believe that there's a chance that Hill himself has one of those positions. But then they're paying a slightly higher rate for yerba mate over free trade. But the amount that they were paying for being like millions and millions of dollars making that they're making was effectively between, like, I think $5.5 and like $17,000 a year for the entirety of the primary product that they're doing, and the labor being drawn out from it again. But ultimately, the thing about this is that the whole concept of fair trade is coming predominantly from this revamped idea that you can have some kind of consumption that's going to enforce the exact same assimilationist policies of colonization into a form that is palatable. And in this case, as in all these other cases, it's entirely fucking bullshit. So you can look at like the fair trade movement that's happening. It's typically a front for missionary organizations and for predatory liberal NGOs who are effectively doing the exact same thing. So one of the other big things that you can see that's like along these lines, places like 10,000 Villages and Plowshare Crafts, they're supposedly like, you know, they're fair trade chocolate, they're fair trade all these goods, and it's carvings of you know, indigenous or tribalized versions of religious iconography. And they don't overtly state any of these missionary goals in any of their propaganda. They're based upon the principles of fair trade and saying, like, we're empowering women, we're empowering indigenous people, we're giving a life of potential to indigenous children that might not have it under any other firms. Those are run by the Mennonite Central Committee. It's actually right down, like 10 miles down the road from me. The Mennonite Central Committee is one of the largest missionary organizations in the entire world. And they're no less predatory, and they're largely responsible for a lot of which you'll see in terms of the white savior complex, and basically set the tone for liberal NGOs to do this kind of predatory white savior outreach work, where it's like, we're going to adopt children from all these different continents, and we're going to tell you how great we're doing, and take pictures of us with, our black child, our Asian child, our Indian child, or like all these different things. And they're trying to kind of create this thing where they can articulate and assimilate individuals from these situations to act as the marketing front for their predatory organizations that are 100% based on assimilation. Again, nobody can fucking ever say colonialism is over. Like, this stuff is happening. Like, this happens down the road for me. This happens everywhere we're seeing it. And like, the people who are thinking, like, this is why I wrote, Cold Personality and focused on Woodruff, a person who is relatively closer in trajectory to myself, coming from a similar perspective, coming of a similar age, and having that same kind of experience of whiteness, because this is the world that we've been handed, and this is the perspective that's been given to us, and it's innately flawed in ways that make it impossible for us to understand the trajectories, the links, and the context under which all of these different elements play together and interact, and you cannot separate them. And so it's like, I mean, I the number one thing I say is, like, there's no ethical consumption, but like I can never buy a Koyaki. Also, so I should say, I should finish that thought. After I put out the podcast and I went through their financials and went through their website, and they were talking at that time about all the work they were doing for the Koyaki people, which is, fucked up. It's an insult. They were showing, and they had the financials there to show that they weren't actually giving much back. When I called them out on it, they erased all that information and overhauled the entire site, removed any mention of the Aceh people themselves. The only place that it hadn't been changed over is I found they had a Spanish language site, it might have Spanish or Portuguese, that still maintains some of that information. But they erased all mention of it, all mention of their mission related to the Aceh people, and more about the same kind of extractivist idea of like, here's this superfood, and here's how it's going to benefit your life. And they changed their whole program from talking about helping indigenous people to influencers talking about lifestyle changes and impacts that yerba mate would have. And I mean, you kind of saw the same sort of thing in the 2000s, knowing other, like, going to some white person's house and somebody would have that little fucking mug and then a metal straw, and they're all like sipping out of it, and it was just like this gross cultural appropriation. But again, that's a big part of the picture, like the isolating, extracting from different cultures and trying to commodify it. So I don't know. I'm not here to stump for companies and products and production, so I'm not gonna say one's innately better than the other, but also, like, I'm more likely, or have been increasingly drawn in by this work into looking at the ones that are theoretically closer in line with what kind of values I think that people who are looking at colonialism would be wanting to promote, and seeing just how predatory they really are and how close to home this really is. And it's really just kind of one of those things of seeing with very open eyes how the system functions. So that's my thoughts on fair trade. Any questions or clarifications? Is there anything that people would like me to cover that I have not covered, or would you just like more details on? Give a second for anybody else to reply. I also know this is a lot of very intense stuff, and it only gets more intense. I mean, the hard part about unraveling this is that it removes any kind of cognitive dissonance that we're kind of like, as white people or settlers, you're kind of instilled with, that's supposed to be like a safety mechanism in some ways to make it palatable to to remain a part of civilization, to remain a part of these consumer chains and everything. Um, the world's a hard place. It didn't have to be. Ocean didn't have to be on fire. None of these things had happened, and the reality of it is that we live in a life. I mean, the reason that people are being drawn towards some of these things, and the reason people are drawn toward ayahuasca, the reason people are drawn towards mate, is that there's this really disgusting kind of voyeuristic, absurd colonial fascination that comes in different forms here. And on the one side, people fighting for maintaining their own way of life and maintaining their ability to sustain themselves and keep subsistence economies, or not, sorry, subsistence life ways and societies in existence, and have had to fight for. Um, the white gaze, the ecotourist kind of voyeurism that we see tries to dip back into this kind of ecology and try and dip back into the system in an extremely predatory and disgusting kind of way that is invisible through the gaze of whiteness, invisible through the gaze of civilization. Like, that's why cultural appropriation is such a huge subject. That's why it's so important. That's why talking about not using sage when you're not taking part in ayahuasca, like all these different aspects, like we have this really perverse relationship with the world as colonizers, where the culture that we have, the fact that whiteness is based on a power dynamic and not a culture, makes it so that that absence is felt. I mean, because we're social animals. We are meant for culture. We are meant for society. We're meant to live in a living world where things are breathing and existing and all this stuff. I mean, there's beauty to this world. There's a wonderful element to understanding the ecology and the beauty of the world that exists and seeing how it struggles and seeing how it continues to exist, but then being removed from that in such a fundamental way and having all those aspects and all those needs that we have as a social animal, as an ecological being, removed and replaced, that it makes it so that there's a feeling of being cheated, which is absolutely true, which is absolutely a real, sincere feeling and a real, sincere reality. But the way that people respond to that is by assuming that what other people have, the relationships that they have, fall along the same kind of extractivist, consumerist relationship. And so what we end up doing, what cultural appropriation ends up doing, is distilling the idea that the community that existed with any of these cultures can be typified by a role of one person, like specifically like a shaman or a healer, or like a medicine or a plant or something like that. The essence of this culture, the blood quantum, like these racist theories, that they have this mystical quality to it, that it contains a kind of oneness that was unscathed by colonialism. And of course, the tragic irony of all this is these cultural practices, the languages, the rituals, the nature of subsistence, the nature of community, the nature of connectedness, was specifically being targeted for eradication by assimilationist policies, by ethnocide, by genocide, by all these processes, by eliminating bison, by eliminating ox, by eliminating sperm whale, by eliminating anything. All these different aspects were specifically being targeted. So when white people or settlers come back around and try to say the piece of me that's missing is the thing that I have identified with this unscathed culture, and it's distilled into this one thing or this product, and I can invite this into my life. I can just sage to get rid of my bad vibes. Like, that is such a predatory thing. And the problem is it's hard to really explain the people from within that white perspective, or that settler perspective, that settler gaze, the consequences and the nature of that power dynamic and the insane brutality and absurdity of this kind of second round of extractivism is just unbearable. And that's why, another reason why this needs to be understood. This is another reason why the ecology of these things has to be understood. Like the hippie movement, the dropout movement, the hipster movement, the ecotourist scene, all these different aspects of it, the wellness, the hipster stuff, it's all based off of these ideas that you can isolate elements of society or elements of humanity and distill them into an experience or a product or a perspective or something like that, and that's going to undermine the costs of what it takes to get to these points, and also implicitly separates and creates cognitive dissonance between our lives and the relationships we have and the perspective of what it takes to sustain those in oppressive terms for the rest of the world and for all these other societies. And we have to undermine that. We have to see these things from different perspectives, because this is how the narratives promote themselves so they can carry on. And so it's extremely important to learn how to understand and to learn to see, and not just say like, okay, now you know this about Goyake or Mate. So now, like, what do you do? Like, do you buy it or not buy it? Like, it's not just about that. It's about saying like the things will start to fall. And if you start to understand the ecology and the nature and the relationship of all this stuff, it becomes more and more important to understand just how vital it is that the discussion about what needs to be done about civilization or the consequences of civilization require a brute honesty about the nature of civilized existence. And it requires you break out of that individualistic mindset and you start to ask bigger questions and start to pull more strands and say, what is my relationship to this thing? What is my relationship to this world? What are the consequences of my action? And instead of saying that and trying to turn around and make that into a platform for like a more ethical consumption or a more ethical way of being, or trying to expunge these aspects from yourself, it means you just have to have this really brute honesty about where these things go and understand you can't isolate any elements of civilization and try and fix them. It's not going to happen. Nobody's going to listen. The changes that are going to be made are at best incremental and at most non-existent. But also this is how power functions. And this is like start to undo the narratives and understanding how power works from another perspective. You start to see the frailty of power. You start to see the frailty of civilization. It's a set of relationships. It is not a biological organism, but it's parasitic upon them. That means that it's weak in those regards. That means it's dependent upon all these different aspects. It means that the colonial empire that has this mighty military is based off of wheat fields, soy fields, corn fields, spread all throughout. It means that all this infrastructure that's spread all throughout, pipelines and everything, railways, ports, all these different aspects are variables that are open to erosion or destruction or any kind of like sabotage. And the frailty of power is in trying that the impossibility is sustaining this empire. And that's how you end up with the ocean on fire. But like the thing can't be about how can I exist better in this situation. There's certainly elements of like reconnection that are vital and important, but like consumption and treating things as consumable, be it culture or be it products, is an innately colonial relationship. And it needs to be removed. Like that needs to be drastically withered away and targeted and understood as a problem and as a thing unto itself. Again, we come back to the beginning here. The wrong question is saying, well, what do we do about this? Or like, that's a harder question. The first thing, you're not going to be able to answer that question. Like, don't answer that question if we're not ready for that. Or you're not necessarily going to be able to have an answer for it. I mean, part of the thing about understanding the nature of power and control is you don't know what the next thing's going to be. You don't like, we know the possibility for pandemics is there. I mean, I've been talking about it for centuries. I'm sorry, not centuries, decades. Big difference. I have not existed for centuries. We're talking about this stuff for centuries, Jesus, decades. But it can happen. And like on the scale of pandemics, like coronavirus was not nearly as drastic as it could have been. But that doesn't mean that the next thing won't be there. And we've already had that kind of like indignant, self-righteous individualism has said, I'm not going to do this again. And the next thing could be much worse. The next thing could be coming at any moment. Like we can't predict the ways it's going to go. We can just see the patterns. And we can understand the weaknesses and understand that these things will continue to expand and erode and to get worse and to get more impacting, to get more, to get harsher. And that's really what we're seeing. So like ask the right questions, start in a different place, start to see how these things link together, and then start to say, it's like, not, well, what are we going to do, but like, how is this thing sustaining itself? And is it sustaining itself? Is it capable of going on any further? What are the weak points? What are the things that people are being saying? What are the points where pressure is being applied currently? And how does that go? How can I plug into that? How can I make more of this? But one of the biggest things really does come down to the very first stage of any of these processes requires and demands a radically different relationship with the narratives of civilization and understanding how it propagates itself and how it continues. And that's where this is at. This is the point of this. That's the point of the work I'm doing. Like, how do you start approaching this from a different perspective? And how do you start to see these narratives and see these situations from outside of this historic idea or idealization or this like individualization or anything like that? So I don't know if anybody has any other questions. Otherwise, we're going about 3 hours. I can go ahead and wrap up. If not, I'll just give it a second here. I appreciate everybody sticking around and everything like that. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, the Primalanarchy podcast is primalanarchy.org. Black and Green Press is where my books are. I've got 3. It's called Personality, which I mentioned. Wildness Anarchy was my first book, but this is the second edition of it. And Gathered Remains. There's more going on. I do have a Patreon. blackandgreenpress.org has a link for support, and it has the Patreon on there. But patreon.com, kevintucker. I do also have a GoFundMe up. I appreciate if people are able to help out. I am disabled and dealing with a number of things, and the debt of Black and Green is pretty incredible. If people can help out, there's a number of links on blackandgreenpress.org in the support section. I'm still releasing the Black and Green Journal. Is available online for those outside the U.S. Black and Green Review became Wild Resistance at the 6th issue. 6, I think, just sold out. 5, I still have copies of. 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all sold out. blackandgreenpress.org has electronic versions of all those. Also, Black and Green Press has some other books that we put out that I'm happy with. There will be more coming out. I don't know that the journal will be going on further. It was very time intensive, labor intensive, and I have a ridiculous amount of debt because of it. I do want to have something come out. Possibly taking that place, but I'm not sure exactly what that would be yet. But in the meantime, I'm like currently really involved with a lot of book projects and some different ideas. I do think I'm probably going to putting out a book that'll have a bunch of the interviews from the past issues, and then also I want to do a book version of one of the sections in it that was important to me. Was Field Notes from the Prime War. It was talking about like understanding or looking at closer some resistance to civilization, some resistance to expansion and extraction. I'd like to expand that and keep going with it, but also like to take some of those stuff out because I think that's really some of the most important stuff. A lot of my essays that were in there and John's essays are in different books. But the Field Notes from the Primal War side is something that's really important to me. And of course, there's some really great interviews. And a couple interviews I probably would have not wanted to run in hindsight, but that's there. But the ebooks are all online. Yeah. Any other questions? Cheers. All right. Well, I really appreciate it, and I'll go ahead and wrap it up, and then I will be sending out a link to everybody. This, do I have Venmo? Yes. I forget what it's called. It got locked out for a while. I do know Cash App is Black and Green Press. Venmo, I think, is just Black and Green. How do I find it? Yes, Black and Green. But yeah, I really appreciate it, and yeah, thank you to everyone who stuck around. And I will probably be listing up some more classes soon. And I like the idea of also trying to figure out a way to kind of continually expand on stuff. So not repeating the same class over and over again, but taking some of the stuff from like a class like this and building on it further. So if people have suggestions or if they have anything they'd like to say, comments, You can email me at theend@blackandgreenpress.org. I post a fair bit on Twitter at Gathered Remains. There's a Facebook page that I do not touch, and then Black and Green Press on Instagram. So I appreciate it, and yeah, see if anybody has anything to say. Thank you all. All right, thanks.